Chapter 12. The Dennis Family. Madame Dennis did not think it proper that two young persons as innocent as her daughter should breakfast with a young man who, although he had been only 3 days in Paris, already came in at 11 o'clock at night and played on the harpsichord till 2 in the morning. In vain the Abbé Brigard affirmed that this double infraction of the rules of her house should in no degree lower her opinion of his pupil, for whom he could answer as for himself. All he could obtain was that the young lady should appear at the dessert. But the Chevalier soon perceived that if their mother had ordered them not to be seen, she had not forbidden them to be heard, for scarcely were they at table, round a veritable devotee's breakfast, composed of a multitude of little dishes, tempting to the eye and delicious to the palate, when the sounds of the spinet were heard, accompanying a voice which was not wanting in compass, but whose frequent errors of intonation showed lamentable inexperience. At the first notes Madame Dennis placed her hand on the Abbé's arm. Then, after an instant's silence, during which she listened with a pleased smile to that music which made the Chevalier's flesh creep, "Do you hear?" she said. "It is our Athanase who is playing, and it is Emily who sings." The Abbé Brigard, making signs that he heard perfectly, trod on Darmental's foot under the table, to hint that this was an opportunity for paying a compliment. "Madam," said the Chevalier, who understood this appeal to his politeness perfectly, "we are doubly indebted to you, for you offer us not only an excellent breakfast, but a delightful concert." "Yes," replied Madame Dennis negligently, "it is those children. They do not know you are here, and they are practicing, but I will go and tell them to stop." Madame Dennis was going to rise. "What, madam?" said Harmental. "Because I come from Ravennes, do you believe me unworthy to make acquaintance with the talents of the capital?" "Heaven preserve me, monsieur, from having such an opinion of you," said Madame Dennis maliciously, "for I know you are a musician. The lodger on the 3rd story told me so." "In that case, madam, perhaps he did not give you a very high idea of my merit," replied the Chevalier, laughing, "for he did not appear to appreciate the little I may possess. He only said that it appeared to him a strange time for music. But listen, Monsieur Raoul," added Madame Dennis, "the parts are changed now. My dear Abbé, it is our Athanase who sings, and it is Emily who accompanies her on the guitar." It appeared that Madame Dennis had a weakness for Athanase, for instead of talking as she did when Emily was singing, she listened from one end to the other to the romance of her favorite, her eyes tenderly fixed on the Abbé Brigard, who, still eating and drinking, contented himself with nodding his head in sign of approbation. Athanase sang a little more correctly than her sister, but for this she made up by a defect at least equivalent in the eyes of the Chevalier. Her voice was equally vulgar. As to Madame Dennis, she beat wrong time with her head, with an air of beatitude which did infinitely more honor to her maternal affection than to her musical intelligence. A duet succeeded to the solos. The young ladies appeared determined to give their whole repertoire. Harmental, in his turn, sought under the table for the Abbé's feet, to crush at least one, but he only found those of Madame Dennis, who, taking this for a personal attention, turned graciously toward him. "Then, Monsieur Raoul," she said, "you come, young and inexperienced, to brave all the dangers of the capital?" "Yes," said the Abbé Brigard, taking upon himself to answer, for fear that Harmental might not be able to resist answering by some joke. "You see in this young man Madame Dennis, the son of a friend who was very dear to me." The Abbé put his table napkin up to his eyes, "and whom, I hope, would do credit to the care I have bestowed on his education." "And monsieur is right," replied Madame Dennis, "for, with his talents and appearance, there is no saying to what he may attain." "Ah, but, Madame Dennis," said the Abbé Brigard, "if you spoil him thus, I shall not bring him to you again. My dear Raoul," continued the Abbé, addressing him in paternal manner, "I hope you will not believe a word of all this." Then, whispering to Madame Dennis, "Such as you see him, he might have remained at Sauvigny, and taken the first place after the squire. He has 3,000 livres a year in the funds." "That is exactly what I intend giving to each of my daughters," replied Madame Dennis, raising her voice, so as to be heard by the Chevalier, and giving a side glance to discover what effect the announcement of such magnificence would have upon him. Unfortunately for the future establishment of the Demoiselles Dennis, The Chevalier was not thinking of uniting the 3,000 livres which his generous mother gave to her daughters to the 1,000 crowns a year which the Abbé Brigod had bestowed on him. The shrill treble of Mademoiselle Emily, the contralto of Mademoiselle Athénise, the accompaniment of both, had recalled to his recollection the pure and flexible voice and the distinguished execution of his neighbor. Thanks to that singular power which a great preoccupation gives us over exterior objects, the Chevalier had escaped from the shivery which was executed in the adjoining room, and was following a sweet melody which floated in his mind, and which protected him, like an enchanted armor, from the sharp sounds which were flying around him. "How he listens," said Madame Denis to Brigod. "'Tis worth while taking trouble for a young man like that. I shall have a bone to pick with Monsieur Fremond." "Who is Monsieur Fremond?" said the Abbé, pouring himself out something to drink. "It is the lodger on the 3rd floor. A contemptible little fellow, with 1,200 francs a year, and whose temper has caused no quarrels with every one in the house, and who came to complain that Monsieur Raoul prevented him and his dog from sleeping." "My dear Madame Denis," replied the Abbé, "you must not quarrel with Monsieur Fremond for that. 2 o'clock in the morning is an unreasonable time, and if my pupil must sit up till then, he must play in the daytime and draw in the evening." "What? Monsieur Raoul draws also?" cried Madame Denis, quite astonished at so much talent. "Draws like Mignard." "Oh, my dear Abbé," said Madame Denis, "if you could but obtain one thing." "What?" asked the Abbé. "That he would take the portrait of our Athénise." The Chevalier awoke from his reverie, as a traveler, asleep on the grass, feels a serpent glide up to him, and instinctively understands that a great danger threatens him. "Abbé!" cried he in a bewildered manner. "No folly." "Oh, what is the matter with your pupil?" asked Madame Denis, quite frightened. Happily, at the moment when the Abbé was seeking a subterfuge, the door opened, and the 2 young ladies entered blushing, and, stepping from right to left, each made a low courtesy. "Well," said Madame Denis, affecting an air of severity, "what is this? Who gave you permission to leave your room?" "Mamma," replied a voice which the Chevalier recognized by its shrill tones for that of Mademoiselle Emily, "we beg pardon if we have done wrong, and are willing to return." "But, mamma," said another voice, which the Chevalier concluded must belong to Mademoiselle Athénise, "we thought that it was agreed that we would come in at dessert." "Well, come in, since you are here. It would be ridiculous now to go back. Besides," added Madame Denis, seating Athénise between herself and Brigod, and Emily between herself and the Chevalier, "young persons are always best, are they not, Abbé? Under their mother's wing." And Madame Denis presented to her daughters a plate of bonbons, from which they helped themselves with a modest air which did honor to their education. The Chevalier, during the discourse and action of Madame Denis, had time to examine her daughters. Mademoiselle Emily was a tall and stiff personage, from 22 to 23, who was said to be very much like her late father, an advantage which did not, however, suffice to gain for her in the maternal heart an affection equal to what Madame Denis entertained for her other 2 children. Thus poor Emily, always afraid of being scolded, retained a natural awkwardness, which the repeated lessons of her dancing master had not been able to conquer. Mademoiselle Athénise, on the contrary, was little, plump, and rosy, and, thanks to her 16 or 17 years, had what is vulgarly called the devil's beauty. She did not resemble either Monsieur or Madame Denis, a singularity which had often exercised the tongues of the Rue Saint-Martin before she went to inhabit the house which her husband had bought in the Rue du Temps-Perdu. In spite of this absence of all likeness to her parents, Mademoiselle Athénise was a declared favorite of her mother, which gave her the assurance that poor Emily wanted. Athénise, however, it must be said, always profited by this favor to excuse the pretended faults of her sister. Although it was scarcely 11 o'clock in the morning, the 2 sisters were dressed as if for a ball, and carried all the trinkets they possessed on their necks, arms, and ears. This apparition, so conformable to the idea which Harmental had formed beforehand of the daughters of his landlady, gave him a new subject for reflection. Since the demoiselles Denis were so exactly what they ought to be, that is to say, in such perfect harmony with their position and education, why was Bathilde, who seemed their equal in rank, as visibly distinguished as they were vulgar? Whence came this immense difference between girls of the same class and age? There must be some secret, which the Chevalier would no doubt know some day or other. A second pressure of the Abbé Brigaud's foot against his made him understand that, however true his reflections were, he had chosen a bad moment for abandoning himself to them. Indeed, Madame Denis took so sovereign an air of dignity that Darmental saw that he had not an instant to lose if he wished to efface and remind the bad impression which his distraction had caused. "Madam," said he directly, with the most gracious air he could assume, "that which I already see of your family fills me with the most lively desire to know the rest. Is not your son at home, and shall not I have the pleasure of seeing him?" "Monsieur," answered Madame Denis, to whom so amiable an address had restored all her good humor, "my son is with M. Jalou, his master, and, unless his business brings him this way, it is improbable that he will make your acquaintance." "Parbleu, my dear pupil," said the Abbé Brigaud, extending his hand toward the door. "You are like Aladdin. It is enough for you to express a wish, and it is fulfilled." Indeed, at this moment they heard on the staircase the song about Marlborough, which at this time had all the charm of novelty. The door was thrown open, and gave entrance to a boy with a laughing face, who much resembled Mademoiselle Athénais. "Good, good, good," said the newcomer, crossing his arms, and remarking the ordinary number of his family increased by the Abbé and the Chevalier. "Not bad, Madame Denis. She sent Boniface to his office with a bit of bread and cheese, saying, 'Beware of indigestion,' and in his absence she gives feasts and suppers. Luckily, poor Boniface has a good nose. He comes through the Rue Montmartre, he snuffs the wind, and says, 'What is going on there at number 5, Rue du Temps Perdu?' So he came, and here he is. Make a place for one." And, joining the action to the word, Boniface drew a chair to the table and sat down between the Abbé and the Chevalier. "Monsieur Boniface," said Madame Denis, trying to assume a severe air, "do you not see that there are strangers here?" "Strangers," said Boniface, taking a dish from the table and setting it before himself. "And who are the strangers? Are you one, Papa Brigaud? Are you one, Monsieur Raoul? You are not a stranger. You are a lodger." And, taking a knife and fork, he set to work in a manner to make up for lost time. "Pardieu, madam," said the Chevalier, "I see with pleasure that I am further advanced than I thought I was. I did not know that I had the honor of being known to Monsieur Boniface." "It would be odd if I did not know you," said the lawyer's clerk, with his mouth full. "You have got my bedroom." "How?" "Madame Denis," said Darmental, "and you left me in ignorance that I had the honor to succeed in my room to the heir apparent of your family. I am no longer astonished to find my room so gaily fitted up. I recognize the cares of a mother. Yes, much good may it do you, but I have one bit of advice to give you. Don't look out a window too much." "Why?" asked Darmental. "Why? Because you have a certain neighbor opposite you." "Mademoiselle Bathilde," said the Chevalier, carried away by his first impulse. "Ah, you know that already?" answered Boniface. "Good, good, good. That will do." "Will you be quiet, monsieur?" cried Madame Denis. "Listen," answered Boniface. "One must inform one's lodgers when one has prohibited things about one's house. You are not in a lawyer's office. You do not know that." "The child is full of wit," said the Abbé Brigaud in that bantering tone, thanks to which it was impossible to know whether he was serious or not. "But," answered Madame Denis, "what would you have in common between Monsieur Raoul and Bathilde?" "What in common? Why, in a week he will be madly in love with her, and it is not worth loving a coquette." "A coquette?" said Darmental. "Yes, a coquette, said Boniface. "I have said it, and I do not draw back. A coquette who flirts with a young man and lives with an old one, without counting that little brute of a Mirza, who eats up all my bonbons, and now bites me every time she meets me." "Leave the room, mademoiselle," cried Madame Denis, rising and making her daughters rise also. "Leave the room. Ears so pure as yours ought not to hear such things." And she pushed Mademoiselle Athénais and Mademoiselle Emily toward the door of their room, where she entered with them. As to Darmental, he felt a violent desire to break Boniface's head with a wine bottle. Nevertheless, seeing the absurdity of the situation, he made an effort and restrained himself. "But," said he, I thought that the bourgeois whom I saw on the terrace, for no doubt it is of him that you speak, Monsieur Boniface. Of himself, the old rascal, what did you think of him? That he was her father. Her father? Not quite. Mademoiselle Bathilde has no father. Then at least her uncle? Her uncle after Bretagne fashion, but in no other manner. Monsieur, said Madame Denis, majestically coming out of the room, to the most distant part which she had doubtless consigned her daughters, I have asked you, once for all, not to talk improprieties before your sisters. Ah, yes, said Boniface. My sisters, do you believe that at their age they cannot understand what I said, particularly Emily, who is 23 years old? Emily is as innocent as a newborn child, said Madame Denis, seating herself between Brigod and Harmental. I should advise you not to reckon on that. I found a pretty romance for Lent in our innocence room. I will show it to you, Père Brigod. You are her confessor, and we shall see if you gave her permission to read her prayers from it. Hold your tongue, mischief maker, said the abbé. Do you not see how you are grieving your mother? Indeed, Madame Denis, ashamed of the scene passing before a young man on whom, with a mother's foresight, she had already begun to cast an eye, was nearly fainting. There is nothing in which men believe less than in women's faintings, and nothing to which they give way more easily, whether he believed in it or not. Harmental was too polite not to show his hostess some attention in such circumstances. He advanced toward her with his arms extended. Madame Denis no sooner saw the support offered to her than she let herself fall, and, throwing her head back, fainted in the Chevalier's arms. Abbé, said Harmental, while Boniface profited by the circumstance to fill his pockets with all the bonbons left on the table. Bring a chair. The abbé pushed forward a chair with the nonchalance of a man familiar with such accidents, and who was beforehand quite secure as to the result. They seated Madame Denis, and Harmental gave her some salts, while the abbé Brigod tapped her softly in the hollow of the hand. But, in spite of these cares, Madame Denis did not appear disposed to return to herself, when all at once, when they least expected it, she started to her feet as if by a spring, and gave a loud cry. Harmental thought that a fit of hysterics was following the fainting. He was truly frightened. There was such an accent of reality in the scream that the poor woman gave. It is nothing, said Boniface. I have only just emptied the water bottle down her back. That is what brought her to. You saw that she did not know how to manage it. Well, what? Continued the pitiless fellow, seeing Madame Denis look angrily at him. It is I. Do you not recognize me, Mother Denis? It is your little Boniface, who loves you so. Madam, said Harmental, much embarrassed at the situation, I am truly distressed at what has passed. Oh, monsieur, cried Madame Denis in tears, I am indeed unfortunate. Come, come, do not cry, Mother Denis. You're already wet enough, said Boniface. You had better go and change your linen. There is nothing so unhealthy as wet clothes. The child is full of sense, said Brigod, and I think you had better follow his advice. If I might join my prayers to those of the abbé, said Harmental, I should beg you, madam, not to inconvenience yourself or us. Besides, we were just going to take leave of you. And you also, abbé, said Madame Denis, with a distressed look at Brigod. As for me, said Brigod, who did not seem to fancy the part of comforter, I am expected at the Hotel Colbert, and I must leave you. Adieu, then, said Madame Denis, making a curtsy, but the water trickling down her clothes took away a great part of its dignity. Adieu, mother, said Boniface, throwing his arms round her neck with the assurance of a spoiled child. Have you nothing to say to Maître Gillou? Adieu, mauvais sujet, replied the poor woman, embracing her son, and yielding to that attraction which a mother cannot resist. Adieu, and be steady. As an image, mother, on condition that you will give us a nice little dish of sweets for dinner. He joined the Abbé Brigod and Harmental, who were already on the landing. Well, well, said the abbé, lifting his hand quickly to his waistcoat pocket. What are you doing there? Oh, I was only looking if there was not a crown in your pocket for your friend Boniface. Here, said the abbé, here is one, and now leave us alone. Papa Brigod, said Boniface, in the effusion of his gratitude. You have the heart of a cardinal, and if the king only makes you an archbishop, on my honor you will be robbed of half. Adieu, Monsieur Raoul, continued he, addressing the Chevalier as familiarly as if he had known him for years. I repeat, take care of Mademoiselle Bathilde if you wish to keep your heart, and give some sweetmeats to Mirza if you care for your legs. And holding by the banister, he cleared the first flight of 12 steps at one bound, and reached the street door without having touched the stair. Brigod descended more quietly behind him, after having given the Chevalier a rendezvous for 8 o'clock in the evening. As to Harmental, he went back thoughtfully to his attic. Chapter 13. The Crimson Ribbon. What occupied the mind of the Chevalier was neither the denouement of the drama where he had chosen so important a part, nor the admirable prudence of the Abbé Brigod in placing him in a house which he habitually visited almost daily, so that his visits, however frequent, could not be remarkable. It was not the dignified speeches of Madame Denis, nor the soprano of Mademoiselle Emily. It was neither the contralto of Mademoiselle Athénise, nor the tricks of M. Boniface. It was simply poor Bathilde, whom he had heard so lightly spoken of. But our reader would be mistaken if he supposed that M. Boniface's brutal accusation had in the least degree altered the sentiments of the Chevalier for the young girl, for an instant's reflection showed him that such an alliance was impossible. Chance might give a charming daughter to an undistinguished father. Necessity may unite a young and elegant woman to an old and vulgar husband. But liaison, such as that attributed to the young girl and the bourgeois of the terrace, can only result from love or interest. Now, between these two there could be no love, and as to interest, the thing was still less probable, for if they were not in absolute poverty, their situation was certainly not above mediocrity, not even a gilded mediocrity of which Horace speaks, with a country house at Tiber and Montmorency, and which results from a pension of 30,000 sestertia from the Augustan treasury, or a government annuity of 6,000 francs, but that poor and miserable mediocrity which only provides from day to day, and which is only prevented from becoming real poverty by incessant labor. Harmental gathered from all this the certainty that Bathilde was neither the daughter, wife, nor mistress of this terrible neighbor, the sight of whom had sufficed to produce such a strange reaction on the growing love of the Chevalier. If she was neither the one nor the other, there was a mystery about her birth, and if so, Bathilde was not what she appeared to be. All was explained: her aristocratic beauty, her finished education. Bathilde was above the position which she was temporarily forced to occupy. There had been in the destiny of this young girl one of those overthrows of fortune, which are for individuals what earthquakes are for towns, and she had been forced to descend to the inferior sphere where he found her. The result of all this was that the Chevalier might, without losing rank in his own estimation, allow himself to love Bathilde. When a man's heart is at war with his pride, he seldom wants excuses to defeat his haughty enemy. Bathilde had now neither name nor family, and nothing prevented the imagination of the man who loved her from raising her to a height even above his own. Consequently, instead of following the friendly advice of M. Boniface, the first thing Harmental did was to go to his window and inspect out his neighbor. It was wide open. If, a week ago, anyone had told the Chevalier that such a simple thing as an open window would have made his heart beat, he would have laughed at the idea. However, so it was, and after drawing a long breath, he settled himself in a corner to watch at his ease a young girl in the opposite room, without being seen by her, for he was afraid of frightening her by that attention which he could only attribute to curiosity, but he soon perceived that the room was deserted. Harmental then opened his window, and at the noise he made in doing so, he saw the elegant head of the greyhound, which, with his ears always on watch, and well worthy of the trust that her mistress had reposed in her in making her guardian of the house, was awake and looking to see who it was that thus disturbed her sleep. Thanks to the indiscreet countertenor of the good man of the terrace and the malice of M. Boniface, the Chevalier already knew two things very important to know, namely, that his neighbor was called Bathilde, a sweet and euphonious appellation, suitable to a young, beautiful, and graceful girl, and that the greyhound was called Mirza, a name which seemed to indicate a no less distinguished rank in the canine aristocracy. Now, as nothing is to be disdained when we wish to conquer a fortress, and the smallest intelligence from within is often more efficacious than the most terrible machines of war, Harmental resolved to commence opening communications with the greyhound, and with the most caressing tone he could give to his voice, he called Mirza. Mirza, who was indolently lying on the cushion, raised her head quickly with an expression of unmistakable astonishment. And indeed, it must have appeared strange to the intelligent little animal that a man so perfectly unknown to her as the Chevalier should address her by her Christian name. She contented herself with fixing on him her uneasy eyes, which, in the half-light where she was placed, sparkled like two carbuncles, and uttering a little dull sound which might pass for a growl. Harmental remembered that the Marquis d'Axelles had tamed the spaniel of Mademoiselle Choyne, which was a much more peevish beast than any greyhound in the world, with roast rabbits' heads, and that he had received for this delicate attention the baton of Marechal de France. And he did not despair of being able to soften by the same kind of attention the surly reception which Mademoiselle Mirza had given to his advances. So he went toward the sugar basin, then returned to the window, armed with 2 pieces of sugar, large enough to be divided ad infinitum. The Chevalier was not mistaken. At the first piece of sugar which fell near her, Mirza negligently advanced her head. Then, being by the aid of smell made aware of the nature of the temptation offered to her, she extended her paw toward it, drew it toward her, took in her teeth, and began to eat it with that languid air peculiar to the race to which she belonged. This operation finished, she passed over her mouth a little red tongue, which showed that in spite of her apparent indifference, which was owing, no doubt, to her excellent education, she was not insensible to surprise her neighbor had prepared for her. Instead of lying down again on the cushion, as she had done the first time, she remained seated, yawning languidly, but wagging her tail to show that she would wake entirely after 2 or 3 such little attentions as she had just had, paid to her. Harmental, who was well acquainted with the habits of all the King Charles's dogs of the pretty women of the day, understood the amiable intentions of Mirza, and not wishing to give her time to change her mind, threw a second piece of sugar, taking care that it should fall at such a distance as to oblige her to leave her cushion to get it. This test would decide whether she was most inclined to laziness or greediness. Mirza remained an instant uncertain, but then greediness carried the day, and she went across the room to fetch the piece of sugar which had rolled under the harpsichord. At this moment a 3rd piece fell near the window, and Mirza came toward it, but there the liberality of the Chevalier stopped. He thought that he had now given enough to require some return, and he contented himself with calling Mirza in a more imperative tone, and showing her the other pieces of sugar which he held in his hand. Mirza this time, instead of looking at the Chevalier with uneasiness or disdain, rested her paws on the window, and began to behave as she would to an old acquaintance. It was finished. Mirza was tamed. The Chevalier remarked that it was now his turn to play the contemptuous with Mirza and to speak to her in order to accustom her to his voice. However, fearing a return of pride on the part of his interlocutor, who sustained her part in the dialogue by little whines and grumblings, he threw her a 4th piece of sugar, which she seized with greater avidity from having been kept waiting. This time, without being called, she came to take her place at the window. The Chevalier's triumph was complete. So complete that Mirza, who the day before had given signs of so superior an intelligence in discovering Bathilde's return, and in running to the door as she descended the staircase, this time discovered neither the one nor the other, so that her mistress, entering all at once, surprised her in the midst of these coquetries with her neighbor. It is but just to say, however, that at the noise the door made in opening, Mirza turned, and recognizing Bathilde, bounded toward her, lavishing on her the most tender caresses. But we must add, to the shame of the species, that this duty once accomplished, she hastened back to the window. This unusual action on the part of the dog naturally guided Bathilde's eyes toward the cause which occasioned it. Her eyes met those of the Chevalier. Bathilde blushed. The Chevalier bowed, and Bathilde, without knowing what she was doing, returned the salute. Her first impulse was to go and close the window, but an instinctive feeling restrained her. She understood that this was giving importance to a thing which had none, and that to put herself on the defensive was to avow herself attacked. In consequence, she crossed to that part of the room where her neighbor's glance could not reach. Then, at the end of a few minutes, when she returned, she found that he had closed his window. Bathilde understood that there was discretion in this action, and she thanked him. Indeed, the Chevalier had just made a masterstroke. On the terms which he was on with his neighbor, it was impossible that both windows should remain open at once. If the Chevalier's window was open, his neighbor's must be shut, and he knew that when that was closed, There was not a chance of seeing even the tip of Mirza's nose behind the curtain, while if on the contrary his window was closed, hers might possibly remain open, and he could watch her passing to and fro or working, which was a great amusement for a poor devil condemned to absolute seclusion. Besides, he had made an immense step. He had saluted Bathilda, and she had returned it. They were no longer strangers to each other. But in order that their acquaintance might advance, he must be careful not to be too brusque. To risk speaking to her after the salute would have been risking too much. It was better to allow Bathilda to believe that it was all the effect of chance. Bathilda did not believe it, but she appeared to do so. The result was that she left her window open, and, seeing her neighbor's close, sat down by her own with a book in her hand. As to Mirza, she jumped onto the stool at her mistress's feet, but instead of resting her head as usual on the knees of the young girl, she placed it on the sill of the window. So much was she occupied with the generous unknown. The Chevalier seated himself in the middle of his room, took his pencils, and thanks to a corner of his curtain skillfully raised, he sketched the delicious picture before him. Unfortunately, the days were short, and toward 3 o'clock the little light, which the clouds and rain had permitted to descend to the earth, began to decline, and Bathilda closed her window. Nevertheless, even in this short time the Chevalier had finished the young girl's head, and the likeness was perfect. There was her waving hair, her fine transparent skin, the graceful curve of her swan-like neck. In fact, all to which art can attain with one of those inimitable models which is the despair of artists. When night closed in, the Abbé Brigard arrived. The Chevalier and he wrapped themselves in their mantles and went toward the Palais Royal. They had, it will be remembered, to examine the ground, the house in which Madame de Sabrin lived, since her husband had been named maitre d'hôtel to the Regent, was number 22, between the Hôtel de la Roche-Guyon and the passage formerly called Passage du Palais Royal, because it was the only one leading from the Rue de Bons Enfants to the Rue de Valois. This passage, now called Passage du Lycée, was closed at the same time as the other gates of the garden, that is to say, at 11 o'clock in the evening. Therefore, having once in her house in the Rue de Bons Enfants, unless it had a second door opening on the Rue de Valois, no one could return to the Palais Royal after 11 o'clock without making a round, either by the Rue Neuve de Petits Champs or by the Cour de Fontaines. Thus it was with Madame de Sabrin's house. It was an exquisite little hotel, built toward the end of the last century, some 25 years before, by a merchant who wished to ape the great lords and have a petite maison of his own. It was a one-storied house, with a stone gallery on which the servants' attics opened and surmounted by a low, tilted roof. Under the first-floor windows was a large balcony which jutted out 3 or 4 feet and extended right across the house, but some iron ornaments, similar to the balcony, and which reached to the terrace, separated the 2 windows on each side from the 3 in the center, as is often done when it is desired to interrupt exterior communications. The 2 facades were exactly similar, only, as the Rue de Valois was 8 or 10 feet lower than that of Bons Enfants, the ground floor windows and door open on a terrace, where was a little garden, filled in spring with charming flowers, but which did not communicate with the street, the only entrance being, as we have said, in the Rue de Bons Enfants. This was all our conspirators could wish. The Regent, once entered into Madame de Sabrin's house, would, provided he stayed after 11 o'clock, which was probable, be taken as a trap, and nothing would be easier than to carry out their plan in the Rue de Bons Enfants, one of the most deserted and gloomy places in the neighborhood. Moreover, as this street was surrounded by very suspicious houses, and frequented by very bad company, it was 100 to 1 that they would not pay any attention to cries which were too frequent in that street to cause any uneasiness, and that if the watch arrived, it would be, according to the custom of that estimable force, long after their intervention could be of any avail. The inspection of the ground finished, the plans laid, and the number of the house taken, they separated. The Abbé to go to the arsenal to give Madame de Maine an account of the proceedings, and Harmental to return to his attic. As on the preceding night, Bathilda's room was lighted, but this time the young girl was not drawing but working. Her light was not put out till 1 o'clock in the morning. As to the good man, he had retired long before Harmental returned. The Chevalier slept badly. Between a love at its commencement and a conspiracy at its height, he naturally experienced some sensations little favorable to sleep, but toward morning fatigue prevailed, and he only awoke on feeling himself violently shaken by the arm. Without doubt, the Chevalier was at that moment in some bad dream, of which this appeared to him the end. For, still half asleep, he stretched out his hand toward the pistols which were at his side. "Ah!" cried the Abbé, "an instant, young man. What a hurry you are in. Open your eyes wide. So, do you not recognize me?" "Ah!" said Harmental, laughing. "It is you, Abbé. You did well to stop me. I dreamed that I was arrested." "A good sign," said the Abbé Brigade. "You know that dreams always go by contraries. All will go well." "Is there anything new?" asked Harmental. "And if there were, how would you receive it?" "I should be enchanted. A thing of this kind once undertaken, the sooner it is finished the better." "Well then," said Brigade, drawing a paper from his pocket and presenting it to the Chevalier, "read and glorify the name of the Lord, for you have your wish." Harmental took the paper, unfolded it as calmly as if it were a matter of no moment, and read as follows. Report of the 27th of March. 2 in the morning. Tonight at 10 o'clock the Regent received a courier from London, who announces for tomorrow the arrival of the Abbé Dubois. As by chance the Regent was supping with Madame, the dispatch was given to him in spite of the late hour. Some minutes before, Mademoiselle de Chartres had asked permission of her father to perform her devotions at the Abbey of Chelles, and he had promised to conduct her there. But on the receipt of this letter his determination was changed, and he has ordered the council to meet at noon. At 3 o'clock the Regent will pay His Majesty a visit at the Tuileries. He has asked for a tete-a-tete, for he is beginning to be impatient at the obstinacy of the Marechal de Villeroy, who will always be present at the interviews between the Regent and His Majesty. Report says that if this obstinacy continue, it will be the worse for the Marshal. At 6 o'clock, the Regent, the Chevalier de Simeon, and the Chevalier de Ravan will sup with Madame de Sabrin. "Ah, ah," said Harmental, and he read the last sentence, weighing every word. "Well, what do you think of this paragraph?" asked the Abbé. The Chevalier jumped from his bed, put on his dressing gown, took from his drawer a crimson ribbon, a hammer, and a nail, and having opened his window, not without throwing a stolen glance at that of his neighbor, he nailed the ribbon on to the outer wall. "There's my answer," said he. "What the devil does that mean?" "That means," said Harmental, "that you may go and tell Madame de Maine that I hope this evening to fulfill my promise to her. And now go away, my dear Abbé, and do not come back for 2 hours, for I expect someone whom it will be better you should not meet." The Abbé, who was prudence itself, did not wait to be told twice, but pressed the Chevalier's hand and left him. 20 minutes afterward Captain Roquefinet entered. Chapter 14. The Rue de Bons Enfants. The evening of the same day, which was Sunday, toward 8 o'clock, at the moment when a considerable group of men and women assembled round a street singer who was playing at the same time the cymbals with his knees and the tambourine with his hands, obstructed the entrance to the Rue de Valois. A musketeer and 2 of the light horse descended a back staircase of the Palais Royal and advanced toward the passage du Lycée, which, as everyone knows, opened onto that street. But seeing the crowd which barred the way, the 3 soldiers stopped and appeared to take counsel. The result of their deliberation was doubtless that they must take another route, for the musketeer, setting the example of new maneuver, threaded the Cour de Fontaines, turned the corner of the Rue de Bons Enfants, and walking rapidly, though he was extremely corpulent, arrived at number 22, which opened as by enchantment at his approach, and closed again on him and his 2 companions. At the moment when they commenced this little detour, a young man, dressed in a dark coat, wrapped in a mantle of the same color, and wearing a broad-brimmed hat pulled down over his eyes, quitted the group which surrounded the singer, singing himself, to the tune of Les Pendus, Vincater, 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 and advancing rapidly toward the passage du Lycée, arrived at the further end in time to see the 3 illustrious vagabonds enter the house, as we have said. He threw a glance round him, and by the light of one of the 3 lanterns, which lighted, or rather ought to have lighted, the whole length of the street, he perceived one of those immense coal-heavers, with a face the color of soot, so well stereotyped by Groys, who was resting against one of the posts of the Hotel de la Rocheguyon, on which he had hung his bag. For an instant he appeared to hesitate to approach this man, but the coal-heaver having sung the same air and the same burden, he appeared to lose all hesitation, and went straight to him. "Well, Captain," said the man in the cloak. "Did you see them?" "As plainly as I see you, Colonel. A musketeer and 2 light horse, but I could not recognize them. However, as the musketeer hid his face in his handkerchief, I presume it was the regent himself, and the 2 light horse are Simeon and Ravan." My scholar," said the captain. "I shall have great pleasure in seeing him again. He is a good boy. At any rate, Captain, take care he does not recognize you." "Recognize me? It must be the devil himself to recognize me, accoutred as I am. It is you, rather, Chevalier, who should take the caution. You have an unfortunately aristocratic air, which does not suit at all with your dress. However, there they are in the trap, and we must take care they do not leave it. Have our people been told?" "Your people, Captain? I know no more of them than they do of me. I quitted the group, singing the burden, which was our signal. Did they hear me? Did they understand me? I know nothing of it. Be easy, Colonel. These fellows hear half a voice and understand half a word." Indeed, as soon as the man in the cloak had left the group, a strange fluctuation which he had not foreseen began to take place in the crowd, which appeared to be composed only of passers-by, so that the song was not finished, nor the collection received. The crowd dispersed. A great many men left the circle, singly or 2 and 2, turning toward each other with an imperceptible gesture of the hand, some by the Rue de Valois, some by the Cour de Fontaines, some by the Palais Royal itself, thus surrounding the Rue de Bonnes Enfants, which seemed to be the center of the rendezvous. In consequence of this maneuver, the intention of which it is easy to understand, there only remained before the singer 10 or 12 women, some children, and a good bourgeois of about 40 years old, who, seeing that the collection was about to begin again, quitted his place with an air of profound contempt for all these new songs, and humming an old pastoral which he placed infinitely above them. It seemed to him that several men as he passed them made him signs, but as he did not belong to any secret society or any Masonic lodge, he went on, singing his favorite, and after having followed the Rue Saint-Honoré to the barrier, the deux Sergeants, turned the corner and disappeared. Almost at the same moment, the man in the cloak, who had been the first to leave the group, reappeared and, accosting the singer, "My friend," said he, "my wife is ill, and your music will prevent her sleeping. If you have no particular reason for remaining here, go to the Place du Palais Royal, and here's a crown to indemnify you." "Thank you, my lord," replied the singer, measuring the social position of the giver by his generosity. "I will go directly. Have you any commissions for the Rue Malfitard?" "No, because I would have executed them into the bargain." The man went away, and as he was at once the center and the cause of the meeting, all that remained disappeared with him. At this moment the clock of the Palais Royal struck 9. The young man drew from his pocket a watch, whose diamond setting contrasted strangely with his simple costume. He said exactly, then turned and went into the Rue de Bonnes Enfants. On arriving opposite number 24, he found the coal-heaver. "And the singer?" asked the latter. "He is gone." "Good. And the post-chaise?" asked the man in the cloak. "It is waiting at the corner of the Rue Bailiff." "Have they taken the precaution of wrapping the wheels and horses' hoofs in rags?" "Yes." "Very good. Now let us wait," said the man in the cloak. "Let us wait," replied the coal-heaver. And all was silent. An hour passed, during which a few rare passers-by crossed the street at intervals, but at length it became almost deserted. The few lighted windows were darkened one after the other, and night, having now nothing to contend with but the 2 lanterns, one of which was opposite the chapel of St. Clair, and the other at the corner of the Rue Bailiff, at length reigned over the domain which it had long claimed. Another hour passed. They heard the watch in the Rue de Valois. Behind him, the keeper of the passage came to close the door. "Good," murmured the man in the cloak. "Now we are sure not be interrupted." "Provided," replied the coal-heaver, "he leaves before day. If he were alone, we might fear his remaining, but Madame de Sabrin will scarcely keep all 3. "Peste, you are right, Captain, and I had not thought of it. However, are all your precautions taken?" "Oh, and your men believe that it is a question of a bet?" "They appear to believe it, at least, and we cannot ask more." "Then it is well understood. Captain, you and your people are drunk. You push me. I fall between the regent and him who has his arm. I separate them. You seize on him and gag him. And at a whistle the carriage arrives, while Simeon and Ravan are held with pistols at their throats. But, answered the coal-heaver in a low voice, if he declares his name. The man in the cloak replied, in a still lower tone, in conspiracies there are no half-measures. If he declares himself, you must kill him. Pest, said the coal-heaver. Let's try to prevent his doing so. There was no reply, and all was again silent. A quarter of an hour passed, and then the center windows were lighted up. Ah, there is something new, they both exclaimed together. At this moment they heard the step of a man who came from the Rue Saint-Honoré and who was preparing to go the whole length of the street. The coal-heaver muttered a terrible oath. However, the man came on, but whether the darkness sufficed to frighten him, or whether he saw something suspicious moving there, it was evident that he experienced some fear. As he reached the Hotel St. Clair, employing that old ruse of cowards who wish to appear brave, he began to sing, but as he advanced, his voice trembled, and though the innocence of the song proved the serenity of his heart, on arriving opposite the passage, he began to cough, which, as we know, in the gamut of terror, indicates a greater degree of fear than singing. Seeing, however, that nothing moved round him, he took courage, and, in a voice more in harmony with his present situation than with the sense of the words, he began, but there he stopped short, not only in his song, but in his walk. For, having perceived two men standing in a doorway, he felt his voice and his legs fail him at once, and he drew up, motionless and silent. Unfortunately, at this moment a shadow approached the window. The coal-heaver saw that a cry might lose all, and moved, as if to spring on the passenger. His companion held him back. "Captain," said he, "do not hurt this man." And then, approaching him, "Pass on, my friend," said he, "but pass quickly and do not look back." The singer did not wait to be told twice, but made off as fast as his little legs and his trembling condition allowed, so that in a few minutes he had disappeared at the corner of the Hotel de Toulouse. "'Twas time," murmured the coal-heaver. "They are opening the window." The two men drew back as far as possible into the shade. The window was opened, and one of the light horse appeared on the balcony. "Well," said a voice, which the coal-heaver and his companion recognized as that of the regent, from the interior of the room. "Well, Simeon, what kind of weather is it?" "Oh," replied Simeon, "I think it snows." "You think it snows?" "Or rains. I do not know which," continued Simeon. "What?" said Ravan. "Can you not tell what is falling?" And he also came on to the balcony. "After all," said Simeon, "I am not sure that anything is falling." "He is dead drunk," said the regent. "Aye," said Simeon, wounded as a more proper as a toper. "I dead drunk. Come here, Monseigneur, come." Though the invitation was given in a strange manner, the regent joined his companions, laughing. By his gait it was easy to see that he himself was more than warmed. "Ah, dead drunk," replied Simeon, holding out his hand to the prince. "Well, I bet you 100 louis that, Regent of France as you are, you will not do what I do." "You hear, Monseigneur," said a female voice from the room. "It is a challenge, and as such I accept it. Done, for 100 louis. I go halves with whoever likes," said Ravan. "Bet with the Marchioness," said Simeon. "I admit no one into my games." "Nor I," said the regent. "Marchioness," cried Ravan, 50 louis to a kiss. Ask Philippe if he permits it." "Yes," said the regent. "It is a golden bargain. You are sure to win. Well, are you ready, Simeon?" "I am. Will you follow me?" "Everywhere. What are you going to do?" "Look." "Where the devil are you going?" "I am going into the Palais Royal." "How?" "By the roofs." And Simeon, seizing that kind of iron fan which we have said separated the windows of the drawing room from those of the bedrooms, began to climb like an ape. "Monseigneur," cried Madame de Sabrin, bounding onto the balcony, and catching the prince by the arm, "I hope you will not follow." "Not follow," said the regent, freeing himself from the Marchioness's arm. "Do you know that I hold as a principle that whatever another man tries I can do? If he goes up to the moon, devil take me if I am not there to knock at the door as soon as he." Did you bet on me, Ravan? Yes, my prince, replied the young man, laughing. Then take your kiss, you have won. And the regent seized the iron bars, climbing behind Simeon, who, active, tall, and slender, was in an instant on the terrace. But I hope you at least will remain, Ravan, said the Marchioness. Long enough to claim your stakes, said the young man, kissing the beautiful fresh cheeks of Madame de Sabrin. Now, adieu, continued he. I am Monseigneur's page. You understand that I must follow him. And Ravan darted on to the perilous road already taken by his companions. The coal-heaver and the man in the cloak uttered an exclamation of astonishment, which was repeated along the street, as if every door had an echo. Ah, what is that? Said Simeon, who had arrived first on the terrace. Do you see double drunkard? Said the regent, seizing the railing of the terrace. It is the watch, and you will get us taken to the guardhouse, but I promise you I will leave you there. At these words those who were in the street were silent, hoping that the Duke and his companions would push the joke no further, but would come down and go out by the ordinary road. Oh, here I am, said the regent, landing on the terrace. Have you had enough, Simeon? No, Monseigneur, replied Simeon, and bending down to Ravan. That is not the watch, continued he, not a musket, not a jerkin. What is the matter? Asked the regent. Nothing, replied Simeon, making a sign to Ravan, except that I continue my ascent and invite you to follow me. And at these words, holding out his hand to the regent, he began to scale the roof, drawing him after him. Ravan brought up the rear. At this sight, as there was no longer any doubt of their intention, the coal-heaver uttered a malediction, and the man in the cloak a cry of rage. Ah, ah, said the regent, striding on the roof and looking down the street, where, by the light from the open window, they saw 8 or 10 men moving. What the devil is that? A plot. Ah, one would suppose they wanted to scale the house. They are furious. I have a mind to ask them what we can do to help them. No joking, Monseigneur, said Simeon. Let us go on. Turn by the Rue Saint-Honoré, said the man in the cloak. Forward, forward. They are pursuing us, said Simeon, quick to the other side, back. I do not know what prevents me, said the man in the cloak, drawing a pistol from his belt and aiming at the regent, from bringing him down like a partridge. Thousand furies, cried the coal-heaver, stopping him. You'll get us all hanged and quartered. But what are we to do? Wait till they come down alone and break their necks. For if Providence is just, that little surprise awaits us. What an idea, Roquefinet. Colonel, no names, if you please. You are right. Pardieu. There is no need. Let us have the idea. Follow me, cried the man in the cloak, springing into the passage. Let us break open the door, and we will take them on the other side, when they jump down. And all that remained of his companions followed him. The others, to the number of 5 or 6, were already making for the Rue Saint-Honoré. Let us go, Monseigneur, said Simeon. We have not a minute to lose. Slide on your back. It is not glorious, but it is safe. I think I hear them in the passage, said the regent. What do you think, Ravan? I do not think at all, said Ravan. I let myself slip. And all 3 descended rapidly and arrived on the terrace. Here, here, said a woman's voice at the moment when Simeon strode over the parapet to descend his iron ladder. Ah, is it you, Marchioness? Said the regent. You are indeed a friend in need. Jump in here, and quickly. The 3 fugitives sprang into the room. Do you like to stop here? Asked Madame de Sabrin. Yes, said Ravan. I will go and look for Canillac in his night watch. No, no, said the regent. They will be scaling your house and treating it as a town taken by assault. Let us gain the Palais Royal. And they descended the staircase rapidly and opened the garden door. There they heard the despairing blows of their pursuers against the iron gates. Strike, strike, my friends, said the regent, running with the carelessness and activity of a young man. The gate is solid and will give you plenty of work. Quick, quick, Monseigneur, cried Simeon, who, thanks to his great height, had jumped to the ground hanging by his arms. There they are at the end of the Rue de Valois. Put your foot on my shoulder, now the other, and let yourself slip into my arms. You are saved, thank God. Draw your sword, Ravan, and let us charge these fellows, said the regent. In the name of heaven, Monseigneur, cried Simeon, follow us. I am not a coward, I believe, but what you would do is mere folly. Here, Ravan. And the young men, each taking one of the Duke's arms, led him down a passage of Palais Royal at the moment when those who were running by the Rue de Valois were at 20 paces from them, and when the door of the passage fell under the efforts of the second troop. The whole reunited band rushed against the gate at the moment that the three gentlemen closed it behind them. Gentlemen, said the regent, saluting with his hand, for as to his hat, heaven knows where that was. I hope, for the sake of your heads, that all this was only a joke, for you are attacking those who are stronger than yourselves. Beware tomorrow of the lieutenant of police. Meanwhile, good night. And a triple shout of laughter petrified the two conspirators leaning against the gate at the head of their breathless companions. This man must have a compact with Satan, cried Harmental. We have lost a bet, my friends, said Roquefort, addressing his men, who stood waiting for orders. But we do not dismiss you yet. It is only postponed. As to the promised sum, you have already had half. Tomorrow, you know where, for the rest. Good evening. I shall be at the rendezvous tomorrow. All the people dispersed, and the two chiefs remain alone. Well, Colonel, said Roquefort, looking Harmental full in the face. Well, Captain, replied the Chevalier, I have a great mind to ask one thing of you. What? Asked Roquefort. To follow me into some crossroad and blow my brains out with your pistol, that this miserable head may be punished and not recognized. Why so? Why? Because in such matters, when one fails, one is but a fool. What am I to say to Madame de Maine now? What? Cried Roquefort. Is it about that little hop on my thumb that you are bothering yourself? Pardieu, you are frantically susceptible. Colonel, why the devil does not her lame husband attend to his own affairs? I should like to have seen your prude with her 2 cardinals and her 3 or 4 marquises, who are bursting with fear at this moment in a corner of the arsenal, while we remain masters of the field of battle. I should like to have seen if they would have climbed walls like lizards. Stay, Colonel, listen to an old fox. To be a good conspirator, you must have, first, what you have, courage, but you must also have what you have not, patience. Morbleu, if I had such an affair in my hands, I would answer for it, that I would bring to a good end, and if you like to make it over me, we will talk of that. But in my place, asked the colonel, what would you say to Madame de Maine? Oh, I should say, my princess. The regent must have been warned by his police, for he did not leave as we expected, and we saw none but his roué companions. Then the Prince de Celimare will say to you, my dear Harmental, we have no resources but in you. Madame de Maine will say that all is not lost since the brave Harmental remains to us. The Count de Laval will grasp your hand, trying to pay you a compliment, which he will not finish, because since his jaws broke his tongue is not active, particularly for compliments. The Cardinal de Polignac will make the sign of the cross. Alberoni will swear enough to shake the heavens. In this manner you will have conciliated everybody, save your amour propre, and may return to hide in your attic, which I advise you not to leave for 3 or 4 days if you do not wish to be hanged. From time to time I will pay you a visit. You will continue to bestow on me some of the liberalities of Spain, because it is of importance to me to live agreeably, and keep up my spirits. Then, at the first opportunity, we recall our brave fellows and take our revenge. Yes, certainly, said Harmental. That is what any other would do, but you see I have some foolish ideas. I cannot lie. Whoever cannot lie cannot act, replied the captain. But what do I see there? The bayonets of the watch, amicable institution. I recognize you there, always a quarter of an hour too late. But now adieu, Colonel, continued he. There is your road. We must separate, said the captain, showing the passage du Palais Royal. And here is mine, added he, pointing to the Rue Neuve de Petit Champs. Go quietly, that they may not know that you ought to run as fast as you can, your hand on your hip so, and singing La Mere Gaudichon. And the captain followed the Rue de Valois at the same pace as the watch, who were 100 paces behind him, singing carelessly as he went. As to the Chevalier, he re-entered the Rue de Bones en Fawn, now as quiet as it had been noisy 10 minutes before, and at the corner of the Rue Bailiff he found the carriage, which, according to its orders, had not moved, and was waiting with the door open, the servant at the step, and the coachman on his box. "To the Arsenal," said the Chevalier. "It is useless," said a voice which made Darmental start. "I know all that has passed, and I will inform those who ought to know. A visit at this hour would be dangerous for all." "Is it you, Abbé?" said Darmental, trying to recognize Brigod in the livery in which he was disguised. "You would render me a real service in taking the news instead of me, for on my honor I do not know what to say." "Well, I shall say," said Brigod, "that you are a brave and loyal gentleman, and that if there were 10 like you in France, all would soon be finished. But we are not here to pay compliments. Getting quickly, where shall I take you?" "It is useless," said Darmental. "I will go on foot." "Get in. It is safer." Darmental complied, and Brigod, dressed as he was, came and sat beside him. "To the corner of the Rue du Gros Chenet and the Rue de Clery," said the Abbé. The coachman, impatient at having waited so long, obeyed quickly. At the place indicated the carriage stopped. The Chevalier got out, and soon disappeared round the corner of the Rue du Temps Perdu. As to the carriage, it rolled on noiselessly toward the boulevards, like a fairy car which does not touch the earth. Chapter 15. Jean Buvat. Our readers must now make a better acquaintance with one of the principal personages in the history which we have undertaken to relate, of whom we have scarcely spoken. We would refer to the good bourgeois, whom we have seen quitting the group in the Rue de Valois, and making for the Barrière des Sergents at the moment when the street singer began his collection, and who, it will be remembered, we have since seen at so inopportune a moment in the Rue de Bones en Fawn. Heaven preserve us from questioning the intelligence of our readers, so as to doubt for a moment that they had recognized in the poor devil to whom the Chevalier de Harmental had rendered such timely assistance the good man of the terrace in the Rue du Temps Perdu. But they cannot know, unless we tell them in detail, what he was physically, morally, and socially. If the reader has not forgotten the little we have already told him, it will be remembered that he was from 40 to 45 years of age. Now, as everyone knows, after 40 years of age, the bourgeois of Paris entirely forgets to care his person, with which he is not generally much occupied, a negligence from which his corporeal graces suffer considerably, particularly when, as in the present instance, his appearance is not to be admired. Our bourgeois was a little man of 5 feet 4, short and fat, disposed to become obese as he advanced in age, and with one of those placid faces where all hair, eyebrows, eyes, and skin seem the same color. In fact, one of those faces of which, at 10 paces, one does not distinguish a feature. The most enthusiastic physiognomist, if he had sought to read on this countenance some high and curious destiny, would have been stopped in his examination as he mounted from his great blue eyes to his depressed forehead, or descended from his half-open mouth to the fold of his double chin. There he would have understood that he had under his eyes one of those heads to which all fermentation is unknown, whose freshness is respected by the passions, good or bad, and who turn nothing in the empty corners of their brain but the burden of some old nursery song. Let us add that Providence, who does nothing by halves, had signed the original, of which we have just offered a copy to our readers, by the characteristic name of Jean Buvat. It is true that the persons who ought to have appreciated the profound nullity of spirit and excellent qualities of heart of this good man suppressed his patronymic, and ordinarily called him Le Bonhomme Buvat. From his earliest youth the little Buvat, who had a marked repugnance for all other kinds of study, manifested a particular inclination for calligraphy. Thus he arrived every morning at the College of Oratorians, where his mother sent him gratis, with his exercises and translations full of faults, but written with a neatness, a regularity, and a beauty which was charming to see. The little Buvat was whipped every day for the idleness of his mind, and received the writing prize every year for the skill of his hand. At 15 years of age he passed from the Epitome Sacri, which he had recommenced 5 times, to the Epitome Graeci, but the professor soon perceived that this was too much for him, and put him back for the 6th time in the Epitome Sacri. Passive as he appeared, young Buvat was not wanting in a certain pride. He came home in the evening crying to his mother, and complaining of the injustice which had been done him, declaring, in his grief, a thing which till then he had been careful not to confess, namely, that there were in the school children of 10 years old more advanced than he was. Widow Buvat, who saw her son start every morning with his exercises perfectly neat, which led her to believe that there could be no fault to be found with them, when the next day to abuse the good fathers. They replied that her son was a good boy, incapable of an evil thought toward God or a bad action toward his neighbor, but that at the same time he was so awfully stupid that they advised her to develop by making him a writing master, the only talent with which nature had blessed him. This counsel was a ray of light for Madame Buvat. She understood that, in this manner, the benefit she should derive from her son would be immediate. She came back to her house and communicated to her son the new plan she had formed for him. Young Buvat saw in this only a means of escaping the castigation which he received every morning, for which the prize, bounding calf, that he received every year was not a compensation. He received the propositions of his mother with great joy, promised her that, before 6 months were over, he would be the first writing master in the capital, and the same day, after having, from his little savings, bought a knife with 4 blades, a packet of quills, and 2 copybooks, set himself to the work. The good oratorians were not deceived as to the true vocation of young Buvat. Calligraphy was with him an art which almost became drawing. At the end of 6 months, like the ape in the Arabian Nights, he wrote 6 kinds of writing and imitated men's faces, trees, and animals. At the end of a year, he had made such progress that he thought he might now give out his prospectus. He worked at it for 3 months, day and night, and almost lost his sight over it. At the end of that time, he had accomplished a chef d'oeuvre. It was not a simple writing, but a real picture representing the creation of the world, and divided almost like the Transfiguration of Raphael. In the upper part, consecrated to Eden, was the eternal Father drawing Eve from the side of the sleeping Adam, and surrounded by those animals which the nobility of their nature brings near to man, such as the lion, the horse, and the dog. At the bottom was the sea, in the depths of which were to be seen swimming the most fantastic fishes, and on the surface a superb 3-deck vessel. On the 2 sides, trees full of birds put the heavens, which they touched with their topmost branches, in communication with the earth, which they grasped with their roots, and in the space left in the middle of all this, in the most perfectly horizontal line, and reproduced in 6 different writings, was the adverb pitilessly. This time the artist was not deceived. The picture produced the effect which he expected. A week afterward, young Buvat had 5 male and 2 female scholars. His reputation increased, and Madame Buvat, after some time passed in greater ease than she had known even in her husband's lifetime, had the satisfaction of dying perfectly secure about her son's future. As to him, after having sufficiently mourned his mother, he pursued the course of his life, one day exactly like the other. He arrived thus at the age of 26 or 27, having passed a stormy part of existence in the eternal calm of his innocent and virtuous good nature. It was about this time that the good man found an opportunity of doing a sublime action, which he did instinctively and simply, as he did everything. But perhaps a man of mind might have passed it over without seeing it, or turned away from it if he had seen it. There was in house number 6, in the Rue de Ordes, of which Buvat occupied the attic, a young couple who were the admiration of the whole quarter for the harmony in which they lived. They appeared made for each other. The husband was a man of from 34 to 35 years of age, of a southern origin, with black eyes, beard and hair, sunburned complexion, and teeth like pearls. He was called Albert du Rocher, and was the son of an ancient Sevenol chief who had been forced to turn Catholic, with all his family, at the persecutions of Monsieur Beville, and half from opposition, half because youth seeks youth. He had entered the household of M. le Duc de Chartres, which was being reformed just at that time, having suffered much in the campaign preceding the Battle of Steinkirk, where the prince had made his debut in arms. Du Rocher had obtained the place of La Neuville, who had been killed in that charge which, conducted by the Duc de Chartres, had decided the victory. The winter had interrupted the campaign, but in the spring M. de Luxembourg had recalled all those officers who shared their life between war and pleasure. The Duc de Chartres, always eager to draw a sword which the jealousy of Louis XIV had so often replaced in the scabbard, was one of the first to answer this appeal. Du Rocher followed him with all his military household. The great day of Neerwinden arrived. The Duc de Chartres had, as usual, the command of the guards, As usual, he charged at their head, but so furiously that 5 times he found himself almost alone in the midst of the enemy. At the 5th time he had near him only a young man whom he scarcely knew. But in the rapid glance which he cast on him, he recognized one of those spirits on whom one may rely, and instead of yielding, as a brigadier of the enemy's army, who had recognized him, proposed him, he blew the proposer's brains out with his pistol. At the same instant 2 shots were fired, one of which took off the prince's hat, and the other turned from the handle of his sword. Scarcely had these 2 shots been fired when those who had discharged them fell simultaneously, thrown down by the prince's companion, one by a saber stroke, the other by a bullet. A general attack took place on these 2 men, who were miraculously saved from any ball. The prince's horse, however, fell under him. The young man who was with him jumped from his, and offered it to him. The prince hesitated to accept this service, which might cost him who rendered it so dear. But the young man, who was tall and powerful, thinking that this was not a moment to exchange politenesses, took the prince's arms and forced him into the saddle. At this moment, M. Darcy, who had lost his pupil in the melee, and who was seeking for him with a detachment of light horse, came up just as, in spite of their courage, the prince and his companion were about to be killed or taken. Both were without wound, although the prince had received 4 bullets in his clothes. The Duc de Chartres held out his hand to his companion and asked him his name, for, although his face was known to him, he had been so short a time in his service that he did not remember his name. The young man replied that he was called Albert du Rocher, and that he had taken the place of La Neuville, who was killed at Steinkirk. Then, turning toward those who had just arrived, "Gentlemen," said the prince, "you have prevented me from being taken, but this gentleman," pointing to du Rocher, "has saved me from being killed." At the end of the campaign, the Duc de Chartres named du Rocher his first equerry, and 3 years afterward, having retained the grateful affection which he had vowed to him, he married him to a young person whom he loved and gave her a dowry. As M. Le Duc de Chartres was still but a young man, this dowry was not large, but he promised to take charge of the advancement of his protégé. This young person was of English origin. Her mother had accompanied Madame Henriette when she came to France to marry Monsieur, and after that princess had been poisoned by the Chevalier, she had passed, as lady-in-waiting, into the service of the Grand Dauphin. But in 1690, the Grand Dauphin died, and the Englishwoman, in her insular pride, refused to stay with Mademoiselle Choyne, and retired to a little country house which she hired near St. Cloud, where she gave herself up entirely to the education of her little Clarice. It was in the journeys of the Duc de Chartres to St. Cloud that du Rocher made acquaintance with this young girl, whom, as we have said, he married in 1697. It was, then, these young people who occupied the first floor of the house of which Beauvat had the attic. The young couple had first a son, whose calligraphic education was confided to Beauvat from the age of 4 years. The young pupil was making the most satisfactory progress when he was carried off by the measles. The despair of the parents was great. Beauvat shared it, the more sincerely that his pupil had shown such aptitude. This sympathy for their grief, on the part of a stranger, attached them to him, and one day, when the young man was complaining of the precarious future of artists, Albert du Rocher proposed to him to use his influence to procure him a place at the government library. Beauvat jumped with joy at the idea of becoming a public functionary, and a month afterward, Beauvat received his brevet as employee at the library in the manuscript department, with a salary of 900 livres a year. From this day, Beauvat, in the pride natural to his new position, neglected his scholars, and gave himself up entirely to the preparation of forms. 900 livres, secured at the end of his life, was quite a fortune, and the worthy writer, thanks to the royal munificence, began to lead a life of ease and comfort, promising his good neighbors that if they had a second child, no one but himself should teach him to write. On their parts, the poor parents wished much to give this increase of occupation to the worthy writer. God heard their desire. Toward the termination of 1702, Clarice was delivered of a daughter. Great was the joy through the whole house. Beauvat did not feel at all at his ease. He ran up and down stairs, beating his thighs with his hands, and singing below his breath the burden of his favorite song, "Then let me go and let me play," etc. That day, for the first time since he had been appointed, that is to say, during 2 years, he arrived at his office at 10:15, instead of 10 o'clock exactly. A supernumerary, who thought that he must be dead, had asked for his place. The little Bathilde was not a week old before Buvat wished to begin teaching her strokes and pot hooks, saying that to learn a thing well, it is necessary to commence young. It was with the greatest difficulty that he was made to understand that he must wait till she was 2 or 3 years old. He resigned himself, but in expectation of that time, he set about preparing copies. At the end of 3 years, Clarisse kept her word, and Buvat had the satisfaction of solemnly put her first pen into the hands of Bathilde. He then returned to his work with all the eagerness of an artist. Page 325, linked to larger image. It was the beginning of the year 1707, and the Duc de Chartres had become Duc d'Orleans by the death of Monsieur, and had at last obtained command in Spain, where he was to conduct the troops to the Maréchal de Berwick. Orders were directly given to all his military household to hold themselves in readiness for the 5th of March. As first equerry, it was necessary that Albert should accompany the prince. This news, which would have formerly given him the highest joy, made him now almost sad, for the health of Clarisse began to fill him with the greatest uneasiness, and the doctor had allowed the word consumption to escape him. Whether Clarisse felt herself seriously attacked, or whether, more natural still, she feared only for her husband, her burst of grief was so wild that Albert himself could not help crying with her, and Lil Bathilde and Buvat cried, because they saw the others cry. The 5th of March arrived. It was a day fixed for departure. In spite of her grief, Clarisse had busied herself with her husband's outfit, and had wished that it was worthy of the prince whom he accompanied. Moreover, in the midst of her tears, a ray of proud joy lit up her face when she saw Albert in his elegant uniform, and on his noble war horse. As to Albert, he was full of hope and pride. The poor wife smiled sadly at his dreams for the future, but in order not to dispirit him at this moment, she shut her grief up in her own heart, and silencing her fears which she had for him, and perhaps also those which she experienced for herself, she was the first to say to him, "Think not of me, but of your honor." The Duc d'Orleans and his corps d'armée entered Catalonia in the first days of April, and advanced directly by forced marches across Aragon. On arriving at Segorbe, the Duke learned that the Maréchal de Berwick held himself in readiness for a decisive battle, and in his eagerness to arrive in time to take part in the action, he sent Albert on at full speed, charging him to tell the Marshal that the Duc d'Orleans was coming to his aid with 10,000 men, and to pray that if it did not interfere with his arrangements, he would wait for him before joining battle. Albert left, but bewildered in the mountains and misled by ignorant guides. He was only a day before the army, and he arrived at the Marshal's camp at the very moment when the engagement was going to commence. Albert asked where the Marshal was. They showed his position on the left of the army, on a little hill, from which he overlooked the whole plain. The Duc de Berwick was there surrounded by his staff. Albert put his horse to the gallop and made straight toward him. The messenger introduced himself to the Marshal and told him the cause of his coming. The Marshal's only answer was to point to the field of battle and tell him to return to the prince and inform him what he had seen. But Albert had smelled powder and was not willing to leave thus. He asked permission to wait till he could at least give him the news of a victory. At that moment, a charge of dragoons seemed necessary to the Marshal. He told one of his aides-de-camp to carry the order to charge to the colonel. The young man started at a gallop, but he had scarcely gone a third of the distance which separated the hill from the position of the regiment, when his head was carried off by a cannonball. Scarcely had he fallen from his stirrups when Albert, seizing this occasion to take part in the battle, set spurs to his horse, transmitted the order to the colonel, and instead of returning to the Marshal, drew his sword and charged at the head of the regiment. This charge was one of the most brilliant of the day, and penetrated so completely to the heart of the Imperial Guard that they began to give way. The Marshal had involuntarily watched the young officer throughout the melee, recognizing him by his uniform. He saw him arrive at the enemy's standard, engage in a personal contest with him who carried it. Then, when the regiment had taken flight, he saw him returning with his conquest in his arms. On reaching the Marshal, he threw the colors at his feet. Opening his mouth to speak, instead of words, it was blood that came to his lips. The Marshal saw him totter in his saddle and advanced to support him, but before he had time to do so, Albert had fallen. A ball had pierced his breast. The Marshal sprung from his horse, but the brave young man lay dead on the standard he had just taken. The Duc d'Orleans arrived the day after battle. He regretted Albert as one regrets a gallant gentleman. But after all, he had died the death of the brave, in the midst of victory and on the colors he himself had taken. What more could be desired by a Frenchman, a soldier, and a gentleman? The Duke wrote with his own hand to the poor widow. If anything could console a wife for the death of her husband, it would doubtless be such a letter. But poor Clarice thought but of one thing, that she had no longer a husband, and that her child had no longer a father. At 4 o'clock, Buvat came in from the library. They told him that Clarice wanted him, and he went down directly. The poor woman did not cry. She did not complain. She stood tearless and speechless, her eyes fixed and hollow as those of a maniac. When Buvat entered, she did not even turn her head toward him, but merely holding out her hand. She presented him the letter. Buvat looked right and left to endeavor to find out what was the matter, but seeing nothing to direct his conjectures, he looked at the paper and read aloud. Madam, your husband has died for France and for me. Neither France nor I can give you back your husband. But remember that if ever you are in want of anything, we are both your debtors. Your affectionate, Philippe d'Orleans. What? Cried Buvat, fixing his great eyes on Clarice. M. du Rocher, it is not possible. Papa is dead, said little Bathilde, leaving the corner where she was playing with her doll, and running to her mother. Is it true that Papa is dead? Alas! Yes, my dear child, said Clarice, finding at once words and tears. Oh, yes, it is true. It is but too true. Unhappy that we are. Madam, said Buvat, who had been seeking for some consolation to offer, you must not grieve thus. Perhaps it is a false report. Do you not see that the letter is from the Duc d'Orleans himself? Cried the poor widow. Yes, my child, your father is dead. Weep, my child. Perhaps in seeing your tears God will have pity on me. And saying these things, the poor widow coughed so painfully that Buvat felt his own breast torn by it. But his fright was still greater when he saw that the handkerchief which she drew from her mouth was covered with blood. Then he understood that a greater misfortune threatened Bathilde than that which had just befallen her. The apartments which Clarice occupied were now too large for her. No one was astonished when she left them for smaller ones on the second floor. Besides her grief, which annihilated all her other faculties, Clarice felt, in common with all other noble hearts, a certain unwillingness to ask, even from her county, a reward for the blood which had been spilled for it, particularly when that blood is still warm, as was that of Albert. The poor widow hesitated to present herself to the minister at war to ask for her due. At the end of 3 months, when she took courage to make the first steps, the taking of Requena and that of Saragossa had already thrown into the shade the battle of Almanza. Clarice showed the prince's letter. The secretary replied that with such a letter she could not fail in obtaining what she wanted, but that she must wait for his highness's return. Clarice looked in a glass at her emaciated face and smiled sadly. Wait, said she. Yes, it would be better, but God knows if I shall have the time. The result of this repulse was that Clarice left her lodging on the second floor for 2 little rooms on the third. The poor widow had no other fortune than her husband's savings. The little dowry which the Duke had given her had disappeared in the purchase of furniture and her husband's outfit. As the new lodging which she took was much smaller than the other, no one was astonished that Clarice sold part of her furniture. The return of the Duc d'Orleans was expected in the autumn, and Clarice counted on this to ameliorate her situation. But, contrary to usual custom, the army, instead of taking winter quarters, continued the campaign, and news arrived that, instead of returning, the Duke was about to lay siege to Lerida. Now, in 1647, the great Condé himself had failed before Lerida, and the new siege, even supposing that it ever came to a successful issue, threatened to be of a terrible length. Clarice risked some new advances. This time they had forgotten even her husband's name. She had again recourse to the prince's letter, which had its ordinary effect. But they told her that after the siege of Lerida the Duke could not fail to return, and the poor widow was again obliged to wait. She left her 2 rooms for a little attic opposite that of Buvat, and she sold the rest of her furniture, only keeping a table, some chairs, Bathilde's little cot, and a bed for herself. Buvat had seen, without taking much notice, these frequent removals, but it was not very difficult to understand his neighbor's situation. Buvat, who was a careful man, had some savings which he had a great wish to put at his neighbor's service. But Clarice's pride increased with her poverty, and poor Buvette had never yet dared to make the offer. 20 times he had gone to her with a little rouleau, which contained his whole fortune of 50 or 60 louis. But every time he left without having dared to take out of his pocket. But one day it happened that Buvette, descending to go to business, having met the landlord who was making his quarterly round, and guessing that his neighbor might be embarrassed, even for so small a sum, took the proprietor into his own room, saying that the day before Madame du Rocher had given him the money, that he might get both receipts at once. The landlord, who had feared delay on the part of his tenant, did not care from whence the money came, and willingly gave the 2 receipts. Buvette, in the naivete of his soul, was tormented by this good action as by a crime. He was 3 or 4 days without daring to present himself to his neighbor, so that when he returned, he found her quite affected by what she thought an act of indifference on his part. Buvette found Clarice so much changed during these few days that he left her wiping his eyes, and for the first time he went to bed without having sung, during the 15 turns he generally took in his bedroom, which was a proof of melancholy preoccupation. The last days of winter passed, and brought, in passing, the news that Lerida had surrendered, and that the young and indefatigable general was about to besiege Tortosa. This was the last blow for poor Clarice. She understood that spring was coming, and with it a new campaign, which would retain the Duke with the army. Strength failed her, and she was obliged to take to her bed. The position of Clarice was frightful. She did not deceive herself as to her illness. She felt that it was mortal, and she had no one in the world to whom she could recommend her child. The poor woman feared death, not on her own account, but on her daughter's, who would not have even the stone of her mother's tomb to rest her head on, for the unfortunate have no tomb. Her husband had only distant relations from whom she could not solicit aid. As to her own family, born in France, where her mother died, she had not even known them. Besides, she understood that if there were any hope from that quarter, there was no longer the time to seek it. Death was approaching. One night Buvette, who the evening before had left Clarice devoured by fever, heard her groaning so deeply that he jumped from his bed and dressed himself to go and offer her help. But on arriving at the door, he did not dare to enter or to knock. Clarice was sobbing and praying aloud. At this moment Bathilde woke and called her mother. Clarice drove back her tears, took her child in the cradle, and placing her on her knees on her own bed, made her repeat what prayers she knew, and between each of them Buvette heard her cry in a sad voice, "Oh, my God! Listen to my poor child." There was in this nocturnal scene, the child scarcely out of the cradle, and a mother halfway to the grave, both addressing the Lord as their only support in the silence of night, something so deeply sad that good Buvette fell on his knees, and inwardly swore, what he had not dared to offer aloud, that though Bathilde might be an orphan, yet she should not be abandoned. God had heard the double prayers which had ascended to him, and he had granted them. The next day Buvette did what he had never dared to do before. He took Bathilde in his arms, leaned his good-natured round face against the charming little face of the child, and said softly, "Be easy, poor little innocent. There are yet good people on the earth." The little girl threw her arms round his neck and kissed him. Buvette felt that the tears stood in his eyes, and as he had often heard that you must not cry before sick people, for fear of agitating them, he drew out his watch, and assuming a gruff voice to conceal his emotion, "It is 10:15, I must go. Good day, Madame du Rocher." On the staircase he met the doctor, and asked him what he thought of the patient, as he was a doctor who came through charity, and did not consider himself at all bound to be considerate when he was not paid. He replied that in 3 days she would be dead. Coming back at 4 o'clock, Buvette found the whole house in commotion. The doctor had said that they must send for the viaticum. They had sent for the cure, and he had arrived, and, preceded by the sacristan and his little bell, he had, without any preparation, entered the sick room. Clarice received it with her hands joined, and her eyes turned toward heaven. But the impression produced on her was not the less terrible. Buvette heard singing, and thought what must have happened. He went up directly and found the landing and the door of the sick room surrounded by all the gossips of the neighborhood, who had, as was the custom at that time, followed the holy sacrament. Round the bed where the dying woman was extended, already so pale and motionless that if it had not been for the two great tears that ran down her cheeks, she might have been taken for a marble statue lying on a tomb. The priests were singing the prayers for the dying, and in a corner of the room the little Bathilde, whom they had separated from her mother, that she might not distract her attention during her last act of religion, was seated on the ground, not daring to cry, frightened at seeing so many people she did not know, and hearing so much she did not understand. As soon as she saw Beuvat, the child ran to him as the only person she knew in this grave assembly. Beuvat took her in his arms and knelt with her near the bed of the dying woman. At this moment, Clarisse lowered her eyes from the heavens toward the earth. Without doubt, she had been addressing a prayer to heaven to send protector to her daughter. She saw Bathilde in the arms of the only friend she had in the world. With the penetrating glance of the dying, she read this pure and devoted heart and saw what he had not dared to tell her. And as she sat up in bed, she held out her hand to him, uttering a cry of gratitude and joy, such as the angels only can understand. And, as if she had exhausted her remaining strength in this maternal outburst, she sank back fainting on the bed. The religious ceremony was finished. The priest retired first, then the pious followed. The indifferent and curious remained till the last. Among this number were several women. Beuvat asked if there was none among them who knew a good sick nurse. One of them presented herself directly, declared, in the midst of a chorus of her companions, that she had all the necessary virtues for this honorable situation, but that, just on account of these good qualities, she was accustomed to be paid a week in advance, as she was much sought after in the neighborhood. Beuvat asked the price of this week. She replied that to any other it would be 16 livres, but as the poor lady did not seem rich, she would be contented with 12. Beuvat, who had just received his month's pay, took 2 crowns from his pocket and gave them to her without bargaining. He would have given double if she had asked it. Clarisse was still fainting. The nurse entered on her duty by giving her some vinegar instead of salts. Beuvat retired. As to Bathilde, she had been told that her mother was asleep. The poor child did not know the difference between sleep and death, and returned to her corner to play with her doll. At the end of an hour, Beuvat returned to ask news of Clarisse. She had recovered from her fainting, but though her eyes were open, she did not speak. However, she recognized him, for as soon as he entered, she joined her hands as if to pray, and then she appeared to seek for something under her bolster. The nurse shook her head, and approaching the patient, "Your pillow is very well," said she. "You must not disarrange it." Then turning to Beuvat, "Ah, these sick people," added she, shrugging her shoulders. "They are always fancying that there is something making them uncomfortable. It is death, only they do not know it." Clarisse sighed deeply, but remained motionless. The nurse approached her, and passed over her lips a feather of a quill dipped in a cordial of her own invention, which she had just been to fetch at the chemist's. Beuvat could not support the spectacle. He recommended the mother and child to care of the nurse, and left. The next day Clarisse was still worse, for though her eyes were open, she did not seem to recognize anyone but her daughter, who was lying near her on the bed, and whose little hand she held. On her part, the child, as if she felt that this was a last maternal embrace, remained quiet and silent. On seeing her kind friend, she only said, "Mama sleeps." It appeared to Beuvat that Clarisse moved as if she heard and recognized her child's voice, but it might have been only a nervous trembling. He asked the nurse if the sick woman had wanted anything. She shook her head, saying, "What would be the use? It would be money thrown away. These apothecaries make quite enough already." Beuvat would have liked to stay with Clarisse, for he saw that she had not long to live, but he never would have thought of absenting himself for a day from business unless he were dying himself. He arrived there then as usual, but so sad and melancholy that the king did not gain much by his presence. They remarked with astonishment that day Beuvat did not wait till 4 o'clock had struck to take off the false blue sleeves which he wore to protect his coat, but that at the first stroke of the clock he got up, took his hat, and went out. The supernumerary, who had already asked for his place, watched him as he went. Then, when he closed the door, "Well," said he, loud enough to be heard by the chief, "there's one who takes it easy." Beuvat's presentiments were confirmed. On arriving at the house, he asked the porter's wife how Clarisse was. "Ah, God be thanked," replied she. "The poor woman is happy. She suffers no more." "She is dead," cried Buvat, with that shudder always produced by this terrible word. "About 3/4 of an hour ago," replied she, and she went on darning her stocking, and singing a merry song which she had interrupted to reply to Buvat. Buvat ascended the steps of the staircase one by one, stopping frequently to wipe his forehead. Then, on arriving on the landing, where was his room and that of Clarice, he was obliged to lean his head against the wall, for he felt his legs fail him. He stood silent and hesitating, when he thought he heard Bathilde's voice crying. He remembered the poor child, and this gave him courage. At the door, however, he stopped again. Then he heard the groans of the little girl more distinctly. "Mama," cried the child, in a little voice broken by sobs, "will you not wake? Mama, why are you so cold?" Then, running to the door and striking with her hand, "Come, my kind friend, come," said she. "I am alone and I am afraid." Buvat was astonished that they had not removed the child from her mother's room, and the profound pity which the poor little creature inspired made him forget the painful feeling which had stopped him for a moment. He then raised his hand, opened the door. The door was locked. At this moment he heard the porter's wife calling him. He ran to the stairs and asked her where the key was. "Ah," replied she, "how stupid I am. I forgot to give it you as you passed." Buvat ran down as quickly as he could. "And why is the key here?" he asked. "The landlord placed it here after he had taken away the furniture," answered she. "What? Taken away the furniture?" cried Buvat. "Of course, he has taken away the furniture. Your neighbor was not rich, Buvat, and no doubt she owes money on all sides. Ah, the landlord will not stand tricks. The rent first. That is but fair. Besides, she does not want furniture any more, poor dear. But the nurse, where is she?" When she saw that her patient was dead, she went away. Her business was finished, but she will come back to shroud her for a crown, if you like. It is generally the portress who does this, but I cannot, I am too sensitive. Buvat understood, shuddering at all that had passed. He went up quickly. His hand shook so that he could scarcely find the lock, but at length the key turned and the door opened. Clarice was extended on the ground on the mattress out her bed, in the middle of the dismantled room. An old sheet was thrown over her, and ought to have hidden her entirely, but little Bathilde had moved it to seek for her mother's face, which she was kissing when he entered. "Ah, my friend," cried she, "wake my mamma, who sleeps still. Wake her, I beg." And the child ran to Buvat, who was watching from the door this pitiable spectacle. Buvat took Bathilde back to the corpse. "Kiss your mother for the last time, my poor child," said he. The child obeyed. "And now," said he, "let her sleep. One day God will wake her." And he took the child in his arms and carried her away. The child made no resistance. She seemed to understand her weakness and her isolation. He put her in his own bed, for they had carried away even the child's cot. And when she was asleep, he went out to give information of the death to the commissary of the quarter and to make arrangements for the funeral. When he returned, the portress gave him a paper, which the nurse had found in Clarice's hand. Buvat opened and recognized a letter from the Duc d'Orleans. This was the sole inheritance which the poor mother had left to her daughter. Chapter 16. Bathilde, in going to make his declaration to the commissary of the quarter and his arrangements for the funeral, Buvat had not forgotten to look for a woman who could take care of little Bathilde, an office which he could not undertake himself. Firstly, because he was entirely ignorant of its duties, and secondly, because it would be impossible to leave the child alone during the 6 hours he spent daily at the office. Fortunately, he knew the very person he wanted, a woman of from 35 to 38 years of age, who had been in Madame Buvat's service, and whose good qualities he had duly appreciated. It was arranged with Ninette, for this was a good woman's name, that she should live in a house, do the cooking, take care of little Bathilde, and have 50 livres a year wages and her board. This new arrangement must greatly change all Buvat's habits, by obliging him to have a housekeeper, whereas he had always lived as a bachelor and taken his meals at an eating house. He could no longer keep his attic, which was now too small for him, and next morning he went in search of new lodging. He found one, Rue Pagevin, as he wished to be near the Royal Library, that he might not have too far to walk in wet weather. This lodging contained 2 rooms, a closet, and a kitchen. He took it on the spot and went to buy the necessary furniture for Bathilde and Nanette's rooms. And the same evening, after his return from business, they moved to their new lodgings. The next day, which was Sunday, Clarisse was buried, so that Buvat had no need to ask for a day's leave even for this. For the first week or two, Bathilde asked constantly for her mamma, but her friend Buvat had brought her a great many pretty playthings to console her, so that she soon began to ask for her less frequently. And as she had been told she had gone to join her father, she at length only asked occasionally when they would both come back. Buvat had put Bathilde in the best room. He kept the other for himself, and put Nanette in the little closet. This Nanette was a good woman, who cooked passably, and knitted splendidly. In spite of these diverse talents, Buvat understood that he and Nanette would not suffice for the education of a young girl, and that though she might write magnificently, know her 5 rules, and be able to sew and knit, she would still know only half of what she should. Buvat had looked the obligation he had undertaken full in the face. His was one of those happy organizations which think with the heart, and he had understood that, though she had become his ward, Bathilde remained the child of Albert and Clarisse. He resolved, then, to give her an education conformable not to her present situation, but to the name she bore. In arriving at this resolution, Buvat had reasoned very simply that he owed his place to Albert, and consequently, the income of that place belonged to Bathilde. This is how he divided his 900 livres a year, for 150 for music, drawing, and dancing masters, for 150 for Bathilde's dowry. Now, supposing that Bathilde, who was 4 years old, should marry at 18, the interest and the capital together would amount to something like 9 or 10,000 francs. This was not much, he knew, and was much troubled by that knowledge, but it was in vain to think he could not make it more. To defray the expense of their living, lodgings, and clothing for himself and Bathilde, he would again begin to give writing lessons and make copies. For this purpose, he got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and went to bed at 10 at night. This would be all profit, for, thanks to this new arrangement, he would lengthen his life by 2 or 3 hours daily. For some time these good resolutions prospered. Neither lessons nor copies were wanting, and as 2 years passed before Bathilde had finished the early education he himself undertook to give her, he was able to add 900 francs to her little treasure. At 6 years old, Bathilde had what the daughters of the richest and noblest houses seldom have: masters for music, drawing, and dancing. Making sacrifices for this charming child was entirely pleasure, for she appeared to have received from God one of those happy organizations whose aptitude makes us believe in a former world, for they appear not so much to be learning a new thing as to be remembering one formerly known. As to her beauty, which had given such early promise, it had amply fulfilled it. Buvat was happy the whole week, while after each lesson he received the compliments of the master, and very proud on Sundays, when, having put on his salmon-colored coat, his black velvet breeches, and chine stockings, he took Bathilde by the hand and went for his weekly walk. It was generally toward the Chemin de Porcherons that he directed his steps. This was a rendezvous for beaux, and Buvat had formerly been a great lover of this game. In ceasing to be an actor, he had become a judge. Whenever a dispute arose, it was referred to him, and his eye was so correct that he could tell at the first glance, and without fail, which ball was nearest a mark. From his judgments there was no appeal, and they were received with neither more nor less respect than those of St. Louis at Vincennes. But it must be said to his credit that his predilection for this walk was not entirely egotistical. It also led to the marsh of the Grange Batelier, whose black and gloomy waters attracted a great many of those dragonflies with the gauzy wings and golden bodies which children delight to pursue. One of Bathilde's greatest amusements was to run, with her green net in her hand, her beautiful fair curls floating in the wind, after the butterflies and dragonflies. The result of this was that Bathilde had many accidents to her white frock, but, provided she was amused, Buvat took very philosophically a spot or a tear. This was Nanette's affair. The good woman scolded well on their return, but Buvat closed her mouth by shrugging his shoulders and saying, "Bah! One can't put old heads on young shoulders." And, as Nanette had a great respect for proverbs, which she occasionally used herself, she generally gave way to the moral of this one. It happened also sometimes, but this was only on fête days, that Buvat complied with Bathilde's request to take her to Montmartre to see the windmills. Then they set out earlier. Nanette took dinner with them, which was destined to be eaten on the esplanade of the abbey. They did not get home till 8 o'clock in the evening, but from the cross to Porcheron, Bathilde slept in Buvat's arms. Things went on thus to the year 1712, at which time the great king found himself so embarrassed in his affairs that the only thing left for him to do was to leave off paying his employees. Buvat was warned of this administrative measure by the cashier, who announced to him one fine morning, when he presented himself to receive his month's pay, that there was no money. Buvat looked at the man with an astonished air. It had never entered into his head that the king could be in want of money. He took no further notice of this answer, convinced that some accident only had interrupted the payment, and went back to his office, singing his favorite. "Pardon," said the supernumerary, who after waiting for 7 years had at last been named employee the first of the preceding month. "You must be very light-hearted to sing when we are no longer paid." "What?" cried Buvat. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I suppose you have not gone to be paid." "Yes, I have just come from there." "Did they pay you?" "No, they said there was no money." "And what do you think of that?" "Oh, I think," said Buvat, "that they will pay the 2 months together." "Oh, yes, 2 months together. Do you hear de Coudray? He thinks they will pay the 2 months together. He is a simple fellow, this Buvat." "We shall see next month," replied the second clerk. "Yes," replied Buvat, to whom this remark appeared very just. "We shall see next month. And if they do not pay you next month, nor the following months, what shall you do, Buvat?" "What shall I do?" said Buvat, astonished that there could be a doubt as to his resolution. "I should come just the same." "What?" "If you were not paid, you would come still." "Monsieur," said Buvat, "for 10 years the king has paid me down on the nail. Surely after that he has a right to ask for a little credit if he is embarrassed." "Vile flatterer," said the clerk. The month passed, and payday came again. Buvat presented himself with the most perfect confidence that they would pay his arrears. But to his astonishment, they told him that there was still no money. Buvat asked when there would be any. The cashier replied that he should like to know. Buvat was quite confused and went away, but this time without singing. The same day the clerk resigned. Now, as it was difficult to replace a clerk who resigned because he was not paid, and whose work must be done all the same, the chief told Buvat, besides his own work, to do that of the missing clerk. Buvat undertook it without murmur, and as his ordinary work had left him some time free, at the end of the month the business was done. They did not pay the 3rd month any more than the 2 others. It was a real bankruptcy, but as has been seen, Buvat never bargained with his duties. What he had promised on the first impulse he did on reflection, but he was forced to attack his treasure, which consisted of 2 years' pay. Meanwhile, Bathilde grew. She was now a young girl of 13 or 14 years old, whose beauty became every day more remarkable, and who began to understand all the difficulties of her position. For some time the walks in the Porcheron and the expedition to Montmartre had been given up under pretext that she preferred remaining at home to draw or play on the harpsichord. Buvat did not understand these sedentary tastes which Bathilde had acquired so suddenly, and as, after having tried 2 or 3 times to go out without her, he found that it was not the walk itself he cared for, he resolved, as he must have erred upon a Sunday, to look for a lodging with garden. But lodgings with gardens were too dear for his finances, and having seen the lodging in the Rue du Temps Perdu, he had the bright idea of replacing the garden by a terrace. He came back to tell Bathilde what he had seen, telling her that the only inconvenience in this lodging would be that their rooms must be separated, and that she would be obliged to sleep on the 4th floor with Nanette, and he on the 5th. This was rather a recommendation to Bathilde. For some time she had begun to feel it inconvenient that her room should be only separated by a door from that of a man still young, and who was neither her father nor her husband. She therefore assured Buvat that the lodging must suit him admirably, and advised him to secure it at once. Buvat was delighted, and at once gave notice to quit his old lodgings, and at the half-term he moved. Bathilde was right, for since her black mantle sketched her beautiful shoulders, since her mittens showed the prettiest fingers in the world, since the Bathilde of former times there was nothing left but her childish feet, everyone began to remark that Buvat was young, that the tutor and the pupil were living under the same roof. In fact, the gossips who, when Bathilde was 6 years old, worshipped Buvat's footsteps, now began to cry out about his criminality because she was 15. Poor Buvat. If ever echo was innocent and pure, it was out of the room which adjoined Bathilde's, and which for 10 years had sheltered his good round head, into which a bad thought had never entered, even in dreams. But on arriving at the Rue du Temps Perdu, it was still worse. In the Rue Pagevin, where his admirable conduct to the child was known, this remembrance had protected him against calumny. But in their new quarter this was quite unknown, and their inscribing themselves under 2 different names prevented any idea of very near relationship. Some supposed that they saw in Bathilde the result of an old passion which the church had forgotten to consecrate. But this idea fell at the first examination. Bathilde was tall and slender, Buvat short and fat. Bathilde had brilliant black eyes. Buvat's were blue and expressionless. Bathilde's face was white and smooth. Buvat's face was bright red. In fact, Bathilde's whole person breathed elegance and distinction, while poor Buvat was a type of vulgar good nature. The result of this was that the women began to look at Bathilde with contempt, and that men called Buvat a lucky fellow. The previsions of the clerk, who resigned, were realized. For 18 months Buvat had not touched a sou of his pay, and yet had not relaxed for a moment in his punctuality. Moreover, he was haunted with a fear that the ministry would turn away a third of the clerks for the sake of economy. Buvat would have looked on the loss of his place as a great misfortune, although it took him 6 hours a day which he might have employed in a lucrative manner. They took care not to dismiss a man who worked the better the less they paid him. Bathilde began to think that there was something passing of which she was ignorant. She thought it would be no use to ask Buvat, and addressing herself to Nanette, who, after a short time, avowed all to her, Bathilde learned for the first time all she owed to Buvat, and that to pay her masters and to amass her dowry, Buvat worked from morning till night, and that in spite of this, as his salary was not paid, he would be obliged sooner or later to tell Bathilde that they must retrench all expenses that were not absolutely necessary. Bathilde's first impulse on learning this devotion was to fall at Buvat's feet and express a gratitude, but she soon understood that, to arrive at her desired end, she must feign ignorance. The next day Bathilde told Buvat, laughing, that it was throwing away money to keep her masters any longer, for she knew as much as they did. And as, in Buvat's eyes, Bathilde's drawings were the most beautiful things in the world, and as, when she sang, he was in the 7th heaven, he found no difficulty in believing her, particularly as her masters, with unusual candor, avowed that their pupil knew enough to study alone. But Bathilde had a purifying influence on all who approached her. Bathilde was not satisfied with saving expense, but also wished to increase his gains. Although she had made equal progress in music and drawing, she understood that drawing was her only resource, and that music could be nothing but a relaxation. She reserved all her attention for drawing, and as she was really very talented, she soon made charming sketches. At last one day she wished to know what they were worth, and she asked Buvat, in going to his office, to show them to the person from whom she bought her paper and crayons, and who lived at the corner of the Rue de Clery. She gave him 2 children's heads which she had drawn from fancy, to ask their value. Buvat undertook the commission without suspecting any trick, and executed it with his ordinary naivete. The dealer, accustomed to such propositions, turned them round and round with a disdainful air, and, criticizing them severely, said that he could only offer 15 francs each for them. Buvat was hurt not by the price offered, but by the disrespectful manner in which the shopkeeper had spoken of Bathilde's talent. He drew them quickly out of the dealer's hands, saying that he thanked him. The man, thinking that Buvat thought the price too small, said that, for friendship's sake, he would go as high as 40 francs for the 2. But Buvat, offended at the slight offered to the genius of his ward, answered dryly that the drawings which he had shown him were not for sale, and that he had only asked their value through curiosity. Everyone knows that from the moment drawings are not for sale, they increase singularly in value, and the dealer at length offered 50 francs. But Buvat, little tempted by this proposition, by which he did not even dream of profiting, took the drawings and left the shop with all the dignity of wounded pride. When he returned, the dealer was standing, as if by chance, at his door. Buvat, seeing him, kept at a distance, but the shopkeeper came to him, and, put his 2 hands on his shoulders, asked him if he would not let him have the 2 drawings for the price he had named. Buvat replied a second time, sharply, that they were not for sale. That is a pity, replied the dealer, for I would have given 80 francs. And he returned to his door with an indifferent air, but watching Buvat as he did so. Buvat, however, went on with a pride that was almost grotesque, and, without turning once, went straight home. Bathilde heard him as he came up the staircase, striking his cane against the balusters, as he was in the habit of doing. She ran out to meet him, for she was very anxious to hear the result of the negotiation, and, with the remains of her childish habits, throwing her arms round his neck. "Well, my friend," asked she, "what did M. Papillon say?" "M. Papillon," replied Buvat, wiping his forehead, "is an impertinent rascal." Poor Bathilde turned pale. "How so?" asked she. "Yes, an impertinent rascal who, instead of admiring your drawings, has dared to criticize them." "Oh, if that is all," said Bathilde, laughing, "he is right. Remember that I am but a scholar." "But did he offer any price?" "Yes," said Buvat. "He had impertinence enough for that." "What price?" asked Bathilde, trembling. "He offered 80 francs." 80 francs, cried Bathilde. "Oh, you must be mistaken." "I tell you he offered 80 francs of the two," replied Buvat, laying a stress on each syllable. "But it is 4 times as much as they are worth," said the young girl, clapping her hand for joy. "It is possible, though I do not think so, but it is none the less true that M. Papillon is an impertinent rascal." This was not Bathilde's opinion, but she changed the conversation, saying that dinner was ready, an announcement which generally gave a new course to Buvat's ideas. Buvat gave back the drawings to Bathilde without further observation, and entered the little sitting-room, singing the inevitable, "Then let me go," etc. He dined with as good an appetite as if there had been no M. Papillon in the world. The same evening, while Buvat was making copies, Bathilde gave the drawings to Nanette, telling her to take them to M. Papillon and ask for the 80 francs he had offered to Buvat. Nanette obeyed, and Bathilde awaited her return with great anxiety, for she still believed there must be some mistake as to the price. 10 minutes afterward she was quite assured, for the good woman entered with the money. Bathilde looked at it for an instant with tears in her eyes, then kneeling before the crucifix at the foot of her bed, she offered up a thanksgiving that she was enabled to return to Buvat a part of what he had done for her. The next day Buvat, in returning from the office, passed before Papillon's door, but his astonishment was great when, through the windows of the shop, he saw the drawings. The door opened and Papillon appeared. "So," said he, "you thought better of it, and made up your mind to part with the 2 drawings which were not for sale? Ah, I did not know you were so cunning, neighbor, but however, tell Mademoiselle Bathilde that, as she is a good girl, out of consideration for her, if she will do 2 such drawings every month, and promise not to draw for anyone else for a year, I will take them at the same price." Buvat was astonished. He grumbled out an answer which the man could not hear, and went home. He went upstairs and opened the door without Bathilde having heard him. She was drawing. She had already begun another head, and perceiving her good friend standing at the door with a troubled air, she put down her paper and pencils and ran to him, asking what was the matter. Buvat wiped away 2 great tears. "So," said he, "the child of my benefactors, of Clarice Gray and Albert du Rocher, is working for her bread." "Father," replied Bathilde, half crying, half laughing, "I am not working. I am amusing myself." The word "father" was substituted on great occasions for "kind friend," and ordinarily had the effect of calming his greatest troubles. But this time it failed. "I am neither your father nor your good friend," murmured he, "but simply poor Buvat, whom the king pays no longer, and who does not gain enough by his writing to continue to give you the education you ought to have." "Oh, you want to make me die with grief," cried Bathilde, bursting into tears. So plainly was Buvat's distress painted on his countenance. "I kill you with grief, my child," said Buvat, with an accent of profound tenderness. "What have I done? What have I said? You must not cry. It wanted nothing but that to make me miserable." "But," said Bathilde, "I shall always cry if you do not let me do what I like." This threat of Bathilde's, puerile as it was, made Buvat tremble, for, Since the day when the child wept for her mother, not a tear had fallen from her eyes. "Well," said Bivat, "do as you like, but promise me that when the king pays my arrears." "Well, well," cried Bethild, interrupting him, "we shall see all that later. Meanwhile, the dinner is getting cold." And, taking him by the arm, she led him into the little room, where, by her jokes and gaiety, she soon succeeded in removing the last traces of sadness from Buvat's face. What would he have said if he had known all? Bethild thought she could do the 2 drawings for M. Papillon in 8 or 10 days. There therefore remained a half, at least, of every month, which he was determined not to lose. She, therefore, charged Nanette to search among the neighbors for some difficult, and, consequently, well-paid needlework, which she could do in Buvat's absence. Nanette easily found what she sought. It was a time for laces. The great ladies paid 50 louis a yard for guipure, and then ran carelessly through the woods with these transparent dresses. The result of this was that many a rent had to be concealed from mothers and husbands, so that at this time there was more to be made by mending than by selling laces. From her first attempt, Bethild did wonders. Her needle seemed to be that of fairy. Nanette received many compliments on the work of the unknown Penelope, who did by day what was undone by night. Thanks to Bethild's industry, they began to have much greater ease in their house. Buvat, more tranquil, and seeing that he must renounce his Sunday walks, determined to be satisfied with the famous terrace which had determined him in the choice of his house. For a week he spent an hour morning and evening taking measures, without anyone knowing what he intended to do. At length he decided on having a fountain, a grotto, and an arbor. Collecting the materials for these, and afterward building them, had occupied all Buvat's spare time for 12 months. During this time, Bethild had passed from her 15th to her 16th year, and the charming child into a beautiful woman. It was during this time that her neighbor, Boniface Dennis, had remarked her, and his mother, who could refuse him nothing, after having been for information to the Rue Page Vin, had presented herself, under pretext of neighborhood, to Buvat and his ward, and, after a little while, invited them both to pass Sunday evenings with her. The invitation was given with so good a grace that there was no means of refusing it, and, indeed, Buvat was delighted that some opportunity of amusement should be presented to Bethild. Besides, as he knew that Madame Dennis had 2 daughters, perhaps he was not sorry to enjoy that triumph which his paternal pride assured of Bethild could not fail to obtain over Mademoiselle Emily and Mademoiselle Athénise. However, things did not pass exactly as he had arranged them. Bethild soon saw the mediocrity of her rivals, so that when they spoke of drawing and called on her to admire some heads by these young ladies, she pretended to have nothing in the house that she could show, while Buvat knew that there were in her portfolio 2 heads, one of the infant Jesus, and one of St. John, both charming. But this was not all. The Mrs. Dennis sang, and when they asked Bethild to sing, she chose a simple little romance in 2 verses, which lasted 5 minutes, instead of the grand scene which Buvat had expected. However, this conduct appeared singularly to increase the regard of Madame Dennis for the young girl, for Madame Dennis was not without some uneasiness with respect to the event of an artistic struggle between the young people. Bethild was overwhelmed with caresses by the good woman, who, when she was gone, declared she was full of talents and modesty, and that she well deserved all the praises lavished upon her. A retired silk mercer raised her voice to recall the strained position of the tutor and the pupil, but Madame Dennis imposed silence on this malicious tongue by declaring that she knew the whole history from beginning to end, and that it did the greatest honor to both her neighbors. It was a small lie, however, of good Madame Dennis, but it was doubtless pardoned in consideration of the intention. As to Boniface, in company he was dumb and a nonentity. He had been this evening so remarkably stupid that Bethild had hardly noticed him at all. But it was not thus with Boniface, who, having admired Bethild from a distance, became quite crazy about her when he saw her near. He began to sit constantly at his window, which obliged Bethild to keep hers closed. For it will be remembered that Boniface then inhabited the room now occupied by the Chevalier de Harmental. This conduct of Bethild, in which it was impossible to see anything but supreme modesty, only augmented the passion of her neighbor. At his request, his mother went again to the Rue Page Vin and to the Rue de Orties, where she had learned, from an old woman, something of the death scene we have related, and in which Buvat played so noble a part. She had forgotten the names, and she only remembered that the father was a handsome young officer who had been killed in Spain, and that the mother was a charming young woman who had died of grief and poverty. Boniface also had been in search of news, and had learned from his employer, who was a friend of Buvat's notary, that every year, for 6 years past, 500 francs had been deposited with him in Bathilde's name, which, with the interest, formed a little capital of 7 or 8,000 francs. This was not much for Boniface, who, as his mother said, would have 3,000 francs a year, but at least it showed that Bathilde was not destitute. At the end of a month, during which time Madame Denis's friendship for Bathilde did not diminish, seeing that her son's love greatly increased, she determined to ask her hand for him. One afternoon, as Buvat returned from business, Madame Denis waited for him at her door and made a sign to him that she had something to say to him. Buvat followed her politely into her room, of which she closed the door, that she might not be interrupted, and when Buvat was seated, she asked for the hand of Bathilde for her son. Buvat was quite bewildered. It had never entered his mind that Bathilde might marry. Life without Bathilde appeared so impossible a thing that he changed color at the bare idea. Madame Denis did not fail to remark the strange effect that her request had produced on Buvat. She would not even allow him to think it had passed unnoticed. She offered him the bottle of salts which she always kept on the chimney-piece, that she might repeat 3 or 4 times a week that her nerves were very sensitive. Buvat, instead of simply smelling the salts from a reasonable distance, put it close up under his nose. The effect was rapid. He bounded to his feet, as if the angel of Habakkuk had taken him by the hair. He sneezed for about 10 minutes. Then, having regained his senses, he said that he understood the honorable proposal made for Bathilde, but that he was only her guardian, that he would tell her the proposal, but must leave her free to accept or refuse. Madame Denis thought this perfectly right, and conducted him to the door, saying that, waiting a reply, she was their very humble servant. Buvat went home, and found Bathilde very uneasy. He was half an hour late, which had not happened before for 10 years. The uneasiness of the young girl was doubled when she saw Buvat's sad and preoccupied air, and she wanted to know directly what was at cause the abstracted mien of her dear friend. Buvat, who had not had time to prepare a speech, tried to put off the explanation till after dinner, but Bathilde declared that she should not go to dinner till she knew what had happened. Buvat was thus obliged to deliver on the spot, and without preparation, Madame Denis's proposal to Bathilde. Bathilde blushed directly, as a young girl always does when they talk to her of marriage. Then, taking the hands of Buvat, who was sitting down, trembling with fear, and looking at him with that sweet smile which was the son of the poor writer, "Then, my dear father," said she, "you have had enough of your daughter, and you wish to get rid of her?" "I," said Buvat, "I who wish to get rid of you. No, my child, it is I who shall die of grief if you leave me." "Then, my father, why you talk to me of marriage?" Because, some day or other you must marry, and if you find a good partner, although, God knows, my little Bathilde deserves someone better than M. Boniface." "No, my father," answered Bathilde, "I do not deserve anyone better than M. Boniface, but I will never marry." "What?" cried Buvat. "You will never marry? Why should I? Are we not happy as we are?" "Are we not happy?" echoed Buvat. "Sabre de bois. I believe we are." Sabre de bois was an exclamation which Buvat allowed himself on great occasions, and which illustrated admirably the pacific inclinations of the worthy fellow. "Well then," continued Bathilde with her angel smile, "if we are happy, let us rest as we are. You know one should not tempt Providence." "Come and kiss me, my child," said Buvat. "You have just lifted Montmartre off my stomach. You did not wish for this marriage then? I wished to see you married to that wretched little imp of a Boniface, against whom I took a dislike the first time I saw him. I did not know why, though I know now. If you did not desire this marriage, why did you speak to me about it? Because you know well that I am not really your father, that I have no authority over you, that you are free." "Indeed, am I free?" answered Bathilde, laughing. "Free as air. Well, then, if I am free, I refuse." "Diable, I am highly satisfied," said Buvat, But how shall I tell it to Madame Denis? How? Tell her that I am too young, that I do not wish to marry, that I want to stop with you always. Come to dinner, said Buvat. Perhaps a bright idea will strike me when I am eating. It is odd. My appetite has come back all of a sudden. Just now, I thought I could not swallow a drop of water. Now I could drink the Seine dry. Buvat drank like a Suisse and ate like an ogre. But in spite of this infraction of his ordinary habits, no bright idea came to his aid, so that he was obliged to tell Madame Denis openly that Bathilde was very much honored by her selection, but that she did not wish to marry. This unexpected response perfectly dumbfounded Madame Denis, who had never imagined that a poor little orphan like Bathilde could refuse so brilliant a match as her son. Consequently, she answered very sharply that everyone was free to act for themselves, and that if Mademoiselle Bathilde chose to be an old maid, she was perfectly welcome. But when she reflected on this refusal, which her maternal pride could not understand, all the old calumnies which she had heard about the young girl and her guardian returned to her mind, and as she was in a disposition to believe them, she made no further doubt that they were true, and when she transmitted their beautiful neighbor's answer to Boniface, she said, to console him for this matrimonial disappointment, that it was very lucky that she had refused, since, if she had accepted, in consequence of what she had learned, she could not have allowed such a marriage to be concluded. Madame Denis thought it unsuited to her dignity that after so humiliating a refusal her son should continue to inhabit the room opposite Bathilde's. So she gave him one on the ground floor and announced that his old one was to let. A week after, as M. Boniface, to revenge himself on Bathilde, was teasing Mirza, who was standing in the doorway, not thinking it fine enough to trust her little white feet out of doors. Mirza, whom the habit of being fed had made very petulant, darted out on M. Boniface and bit him cruelly in the calf. It was in consequence of this that the poor fellow, whose heart or leg was not very well healed, cautioned Harmental to beware of the coquetry of Bathilde, and to throw a sop to Mirza. Chapter 17. First Love. M. Boniface's room remained vacant for 3 or 4 months, when one day Bathilde, who was accustomed to see the window closed, on raising her eyes found that it was open, and at the window she saw a strange face. It was that of Harmental. Few such faces as that of the Chevalier were seen in the Rue du Temps Perdu. Bathilde, admirably situated behind her curtain, for seeing without being seen, was attracted involuntarily. There was in our hero's features a distinction and an elegance which could not escape Bathilde's eyes. The Chevalier's dress, simple as it was, betrayed the elegance of the wearer. Then Bathilde had heard him give some orders, and they had been given with that inflection of voice which indicates in him who possesses it the habit of command. The young girl had discovered at the first glance that this man was very superior in all respects to him whom he succeeded in the possession of this little room, and with that instinct so natural to persons of good birth, she at once recognized him as being of high family. The same day the Chevalier had tried his harpsichord. At the first sound of the instrument, Bathilde had raised her head. The Chevalier, though he did not know that he had a listener, or perhaps because he did not know it, went on with preludes and fantasies, which showed an amateur of no mean talents. At these sounds, which seemed to wake all the musical chords of her own organization, Bathilde had risen and approached a window that she might not lose a note, for such an amusement was unheard of in the Rue du Temps Perdu. Then it was that Harmental had seen against the window the charming little fingers of his neighbor, and had driven him away by turning round so quickly that Bathilde could not doubt she had been seen. The next day Bathilde thought it was a long time since she had played, and sat down to her instrument. She began nervously, she knew not why, but as she was an excellent musician, her fears soon passed away, and it was then that she executed so brilliantly that piece from Armida would have been heard with so much astonishment by the Chevalier and the Abbé Brigard. We have said how the following morning the Chevalier had seen Buvat and become acquainted with Bathilde's name. The appearance of the young girl had made the deeper impression on the Chevalier from its being so unexpected in such a place, and he was still under the influence of the charm when Roquefort entered, and gave a new direction to his thoughts, which, however, soon returned to Bathilde. The next day, Bathilde, who, profiting by the first ray of a spring sun, was early at her window, noticed in her turn that the eyes of the Chevalier were ardently fixed upon her. She had noticed his face, young and handsome, but to which the thought of the responsibility he had taken gave a certain air of sadness. But sadness and youth go so badly together that this anomaly had struck her. This handsome young man had something to annoy him. Perhaps he was unhappy. What could it be? Thus, from the second time she had seen him, Bathilde had very naturally meditated about the Chevalier. This had not prevented Bathilde from shutting her window, but from behind her window, she still saw the outline of the Chevalier's sad face. She felt that Harmental was sad, and when she sat down to her harpsichord, was it not from a secret feeling that music is a consoler of troubled hearts? That evening it was Harmental who played, and Bathilde listened with all her soul to the melodious voice which spoke of love in the dead of night. Unluckily for the Chevalier, who, seeing the shadow of the young girl behind the drapery, began to think that he was making a favorable impression on the other side of the street, he had been interrupted in his concert by the lodger on the third floor. But the most important thing was accomplished. There was already a point of sympathy between the two young people, and they already spoke that language of the heart, the most dangerous of all. Moreover, Bathilde, who had dreamed all night about music and a little about the musician, felt that something strange and unknown to her was going on, and, attracted as she was toward the window, she kept it scrupulously closed. From this resulted a movement of impatience, under the influence of which the Chevalier had gone to breakfast with Madame Denis. There he had learned one important piece of news, which was that Bathilde was neither the daughter, the wife, nor the niece of Beauvat. Thus he went upstairs joyfully, and, finding the window open, he had put himself, in spite of the friendly advice of Boniface, in communication with Mirza by means of bribing her with sugar. The unexpected return of Bathilde had interrupted this amusement. The Chevalier, in his egotistical delicacy, had shut his window, but before the window had been shut, a salute had been exchanged between the two young people. This was more than Bathilde had ever accorded to any man. Not that she had not from time to time exchanged salutes with some acquaintance of Beauvat's, but this was the first time she had blushed as she did so. The next day Bathilde had seen the Chevalier at his window, and, without being able to understand the action, had seen him nail a crimson ribbon to the outer wall. But what she had particularly remarked was the extraordinary animation visible on the face of the young man. Half an hour afterward she had seen with the Chevalier a man perfectly unknown to her, but whose appearance was not reassuring. This was Captain Roquefinette. Bathilde had also remarked, with a vague uneasiness, that as soon as the man with the long sword had entered, the Chevalier had fastened the door. The Chevalier, as is easy to understand, had a long conference with the captain, for they had to arrange all the preparations for the evening's expedition. The Chevalier's window remained thus so long closed that Bathilde, thinking that it had gone out, had thought she might as well open hers. Hardly was it open, however, when her neighbors, which had seemed only to wait the moment to put itself in communication with her, opened in turn. Luckily for Bathilde, who would have been much embarrassed by this circumstance, she was in that part of the room where the Chevalier could not see her. She determined, therefore, to remain where she was, and sat down near the second half of the window, which was still shut. Mirza, however, who had not the same scruples as her mistress, hardly saw the Chevalier before she ran to the window, placed her front paws on the sill, and began dancing on her hind ones. These attentions were rewarded, as she expected, by a first, then a second, then a third lump of sugar, but this third bit, to the no small astonishment of Bathilde, was wrapped up in a piece of paper. This piece of paper troubled Bathilde a great deal more than it did Mirza, who, accustomed to crackers and sucre de pomme, soon got the sugar out of its envelope by means of her paws, and, as she thought very much of the inside and very little of the wrapper, she ate the sugar and, leaving the paper, ran to the window. But the Chevalier was gone, satisfied, no doubt, of Mirza's skill. He had retired into his room. Bathilde was very much embarrassed. She had seen at the first glance that the paper contained 3 or 4 lines of writing, but in spite of the sudden friendship which her neighbors seemed to have acquired from Mirza, it was evidently not to Mirza that he was writing letters. It must, therefore, be to her. What should she do? Go and tear it up? That would be noble and proper. But even if it were possible to do such a thing, the paper in which the sugar had been wrapped might have been written on some time, and then the action would be ridiculous in the highest degree, and it would show, at any rate, that she thought about the letter. Bathilde resolved, then, to leave things as they were. The Chevalier could not know that she was at home, since he had not seen her. He could not, therefore, draw any deduction from the fact that the paper remained on the floor. She therefore continued to work, or rather to reflect, hidden behind her curtain, as the Chevalier probably was behind his. In about an hour, of which it must be confessed Bathilde passed 3/4 with her eyes fixed on the paper, Nanette entered. Bathilde, without moving, told her to shut the window. Nanette obeyed, but in returning she saw the paper. "What is that?" asked she, stooping down to pick it up. "Nothing," answered Bathilde quickly, forgetting that Nanette could not read. "Only a paper which has fallen out of my pocket." Then, after an instant's pause and with a visible effort, "and which you may throw on the fire," continued she, "but perhaps it may be something important." "See what it is, at all events, mademoiselle." And Nanette presented the letter to Bathilde. The temptation was too strong to resist. Bathilde cast her eyes on the paper, affecting an air of indifference as well as she could, and read as follows. "They say you are an orphan. I have no parents. We are, then, brother and sister before God. This evening I run a great danger, but I hope to come out safe and sound, and my sister, Bathilde, will pray for her brother Raoul." "You are right," said Bathilde in a moved voice, and taking the paper from the hands of Nanette. "That paper is more important than I thought." And she put Harmental's letter in the pocket of her apron. 5 minutes after Nanette, who came in 20 times a day without any particular reason, went out as she had entered and left Bathilde alone. Bathilde had only just glanced at the letter, and it had seemed to dazzle her. As soon as Nanette was gone, she read it a second time. It would have been impossible to have said more in fewer words. If Harmental had taken a whole day to combine every word of the billet, instead of writing on the spur of the moment, he could not have done it better. Indeed, he established a similarity of position between himself and the orphan. He interested Bathilde in her neighbor's fate on account of menacing danger, a danger which would appear all the greater to the young girl from her not knowing its nature. And finally, the expression brother and sister, so skillfully glided in at the end, and asked a simple prayer, excluded from these first advances all idea of love. It followed, therefore, that if at this moment Bathilde had found herself vis-a-vis with Harmental, instead of being embarrassed and blushing, as a young girl would have just received her first love letter, she would have taken by the hand and said to him, smiling, "Be satisfied, I will pray for you." There remained, however, on the mind of Bathilde something more dangerous than all the declarations in the world, and that was the idea of the peril which her neighbor ran. By a sort of presentiment with which she had been seized on seeing him, with a face so different from his ordinary expression, nailed a crimson ribbon to his window, and would draw it directly the captain entered. She was almost sure that the danger was somehow connected with this new personage, whom she had never seen before. But how did this danger concern him? What was the nature of the danger itself? This was what she asked herself in vain. She thought of a duel, but to a man such as the Chevalier appeared to be, a duel was not one of those dangers for which one asks the prayers of women. Besides, the hour named was not suitable to duels. Bathilde lost herself in her conjectures, but in losing herself, she thought of the Chevalier, always of the Chevalier, and of nothing but the Chevalier, and if he had calculated upon such an effect, it must be owned that his calculations were woefully true for poor Bathilde. The day passed, and whether it was intentional, or whether it was that he was otherwise employed, Bathilde saw him no more, and his window remained closed. When Beauvat came home as usual, at 10 minutes after 4, he found the young girl so much preoccupied that, although his perspicacity was not great in such matters, he asked her 3 or 4 times if anything was wrong. Each time she answered by one of those smiles which supplied Beauvat with enough to do in looking at her, and it followed that, in spite of these repeated questions, Bathilde kept her secret. After dinner, Cholu's servant, entered. He came to ask Beauvat to spend the evening with his master. The Abbé Cholu was one of Beauvat's best patrons, and often came to his house, for he had taken a great liking for Bathilde. The poor abbé became blind, but not so entirely as not to be able to recognize a pretty face, though it is true that he saw it across a cloud. The abbé had told Bathilde, in his sexagenarian gallantry, that his only consolation was that it is thus that one sees the angels. Bathilde thanked the good abbé from the bottom of her heart for thus getting her an evening's solitude. She knew that when Beauvat went to the Abbé Cholu, he ordinarily stayed some time. She hoped then, that he would stop late as usual. Poor Buvette went out, without imagining that for the first time she desired his absence. Buvette was a lounger, as every bourgeois of Paris ought to be. From one end to the other of the Palais Royal, he stared at the shops, stopping for the 1,000th time before the things which generally drew his attention. On leaving the colonnade, he heard singing and saw a group of men and women who were listening to the songs. He joined them and listened too. At the moment of the collection, he went away, not from a bad heart, nor that he would have wished to refuse the admirable musician the reward which was his due, but that by an old habit, of which time had proved the advantage, he always came out without money, so that by whatever he was tempted, he was sure to overcome the temptation. This evening, he was much tempted to drop a sou into the singer's bowl, but as he had not a sou in his pocket, he was obliged to go away. He made his way then, as we have seen, toward the Barrière des Sergents, passed up the Rue du Coq, crossed the Pont Neuf, returned along the quay so far as the Rue Mazarine. It was in Rue Mazarine that the Abbé Chaulou lived. The Abbé Chaulou recognized Buvette, whose excellent qualities he had appreciated during their 2 years' acquaintance, and with much pressing on his part, and many difficulties on Buvette's, made him sit down near himself, before a table covered with papers. It is true that at first Buvette sat on the very edge of his chair. Gradually, however, he got further and further on, put his hat on the ground, took his cane between his legs, and found himself sitting almost like anyone else. The work that there was to be done did not promise a short sitting. There were 30 or 40 poems on the table to be classified, numbered, and, as the Abbé's servant was his amanuensis, corrected, so that it was 11 o'clock before they thought that it had struck 9. They had just finished, and Buvette rose, horrified at having come home at such an hour. It was the first time such a thing had ever happened to him. He rolled up the manuscript, tied it with a red ribbon, which had probably served as a sash to Mademoiselle de Launay, put it in his pocket, took his cane, picked up his hat, and left the house, abridging his leave-taking as much as possible. To add to his misfortunes, there was no moonlight. The night was cloudy. Buvette regretted not having 2 sous in his pocket to cross the ferry, which was then where now stands the Pont des Arts. But we have already explained Buvette's theory to our readers, and he was obliged to return as he had come, by the Quai Connie, the Rue Pont Neuf, the Rue du Coq, and the Rue Saint-Honoré. Everything had gone right so far, and except the statue of Henri IV, of which Buvette had forgotten either the existence or the place, and which had frightened him terribly, and the Samaritain, which, 50 steps off, had struck the half-hour without any preparation, the noise of which had made poor belated Buvette tremble from head to foot. He had run no real peril, but on arriving at the Rue de Bones Enfants, things took a different look. In the first place, the aspect of the street itself, long, narrow, and only lighted by 2 flickering lanterns in the whole length, was not reassuring, and this evening had to Buvette a very singular appearance. He did not know whether he was asleep or awake. He fancied that he saw before him some fantastic vision, such as he had heard told of the old Flemish sorceries. The streets seemed alive, the posts seemed to oppose themselves to his passage. The recesses of the doors whispered to each. Other men crossed like shadows from one side of the street to the other. At last, when it arrived at number 24, he was stopped, as we have seen, by the Chevalier and the captain. It was then that Harmental had recognized him, and had protected him against the first impulse of Roquevanet, inviting him to continue his route as quickly as possible. There was no need to repeat the request. Buvette set off at trot, gained the Place de Victoires, the Rue du Mail, the Rue Montmartre, and at last arrived at his own house, number 4, Rue du Temps Perdu, where, nevertheless, he did not think himself safe till he had shut the door and bolted it behind him. There he stopped an instant to breathe and to light his candle, then ascended the stairs, but he felt in his legs the effect of the occurrence, for he trembled so that he could hardly get to the top. As to Bathilde, she had remained alone, getting more and more uneasy as the evening advanced. Up to 7 o'clock, she had seen a light in her neighbor's room, but at that time a lamp had been extinguished and had not been relighted. Then Bathilde's time became divided between 2 occupations, one of which consisted in standing at her window to see if her neighbor did not return, the other in kneeling before the crucifix, where she said her evening prayers. She heard 9, 10, 11, and 11:30 strike successively. She had heard all the noises in the streets die away one by one, and sink gradually into that vague and heavy sound which seems the breathing of a sleeping town, and all this without bringing her the slightest inkling, as to whether he who had called himself her brother had sunk under the danger which hung over his head, or come triumphant through the crisis. She was then in her own room, without light, so that no one might see that she was watching and kneeling before a crucifix for the 10th time, when the door opened, and by the light of his candle she saw Buvat so pale and haggard that she knew in an instant that something must have happened to him. And she rose, in spite of the uneasiness she felt for another, and darted toward him, asking what was the matter. But it was no easy thing to make Buvat speak, in the state he then was. The shock had reached his mind, and his tongue stammered as much as his legs trembled. Still, when Buvat was seated in his easy chair and had wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, when he had made 2 or 3 journeys to the door to see that his terrible host of the Rue de Bones en Faune had not followed him home, he began to stutter out his adventure. He told how he had been stopped in the Rue de Bones en Faune by a band of robbers, whose lieutenant, a ferocious-looking man nearly 6 feet high, had wanted to kill him, when the captain had come and saved his life. Bathilde listened with rapt attention, first, because she loved her guardian sincerely, and that his condition showed that, right or wrong, he had been greatly terrified. Next, because nothing that happened that night seemed indifferent to her, and, strange as the idea was, it seemed to her that the handsome young man was not wholly unconnected with the scene in which Buvat had just played a part. She asked him if he had time to observe the face of the young man who had come to his aid and save his life. Buvat answered that he had seen him face to face, as he saw her at that moment, and that the proof was that he was a handsome young man from 5 to 26, in a large felt hat and wrapped in a cloak. Moreover, in the movement which he had made in stretching out his hand to protect him, the cloak had opened and shown that, besides a sword, he carried a pair of pistols in his belt. These details were too precise to allow Buvat to be accused of dreaming. Preoccupied as Bathilde was with the danger which the Chevalier ran, she was none the less touched by that, smaller no doubt, but still real, which Buvat had just escaped. And as repose is the best remedy for all shocks, physical or moral, after offering the glass of wine and sugar which he allowed himself on great occasions, and which nevertheless he refused on this one, she reminded him of his bed, where he ought to have been 2 hours before. The shock had been violent enough to deprive Buvat of all wish for sleep, and even convince him that he should sleep badly that night. But he reflected that in sitting up he should force Bathilde to sit up, and should see her in the morning with red eyes and pale cheeks, and, with his usual sacrifice of self, he told Bathilde that she was right, that he felt that sleep would do him good, lit his candle, kissed her forehead, and went up to his own room, not without stopping 2 or 3 times on the staircase to hear if there was any noise. Left alone, Bathilde listened to the steps of Buvat, who went up into his own room. Then she heard the creaking of his door, which he double-locked. Then, almost as trembling as Buvat himself, she ran to the window, forgetting even to pray. She remained thus for nearly an hour, but without having kept any measure of time. Then she gave a cry of joy, for through the window, which no curtain now obscured, she saw her neighbor's door open, and Harmental enter with a candle in his hand. By a miracle of foresight, Bathilde had been right. The man in the felt hat and cloak, who had protected Buvat, was really the young stranger, for the stranger had on a felt hat and a cloak, and moreover, hardly had he returned and shut the door, with almost as much care as Buvat had his, and thrown his cloak on a chair, than she saw that he had a tight coat of a dark color, and in his belt a sword and pistols. There was no longer any doubt. It was from head to foot the description given by Buvat. Bathilde was the more able to assure herself of this, that Harmental, without taking off any of his attire, took 2 or 3 turns his room, his arms crossed, and thinking deeply. Then he took his pistols from his belt, assured himself that they were primed, and placed them on the table near his bed, unclasped his sword, took a half out of the scabbard, replaced it, and put it under his pillow. Then, shaking his head, as if to shake out the somber ideas that annoyed him, he approached the window, opened it, and gazed earnestly at that of the young girl, who, forgetting that she could not be seen, stepped back and let the curtain fall before her, as if the darkness which surrounded her were not a sufficient screen. By a miracle of foresight, Bathilde had been right. The man in the felt hat and the cloak, who had protected Buvat, was really the young stranger, for the stranger had on a felt hat and a cloak, and moreover, hardly had he returned and shut the door, with almost as much care as Buvat had his, and thrown his cloak on a chair, and she saw that he had a tight coat of a dark color, and in his belt a sword and pistols. She remained thus motionless and silent, her hand on her heart, as if to still its beatings. Then she quietly raised the curtain, but that of her neighbor was down, and she saw nothing but his shadow passing and repassing before it. Chapter 18. The Consul Duilius. The morning following the day, or rather the night, on which the events we had just related had occurred, the Duc d'Orleans, who had returned to Palais Royal without accident, after having slept all night as usual, passed into his study at his accustomed hour, that is to say, about 11 o'clock. Thanks to the sang-froid with which nature had blessed him, and which he owed chiefly to his great courage, to his disdain for danger, and his carelessness of death, not only was it impossible to observe in him any change from his ordinary calm, which ennui only turned to gloom, but he had most probably already forgotten the strange event which he had so nearly been the victim. The study into which he had just entered was remarkable as belonging to a man at once a savant, a politician, and an artist. Thus a large table covered with green cloth and loaded with papers, inkstand, and pens occupied the middle of the room, but all round on desks, on easels, on stands, where an opera commenced, a half-finished drawing, a chemical retort, etc. The Regent, with a strange versatility of mind, passed in an instant from the deepest problems of politics to the most capricious fancies of painting, and from the most delicate calculations of chemistry to the somber or joyous inspirations of music. The Regent feared nothing but ennui, that enemy against whom he struggled unceasingly, without ever quite succeeding in conquering it, and which, repulsed by work, study, or pleasure, yet remained in sight, if one may say so, like one of those clouds on the horizon, toward which, even in the finest days, the pilot involuntarily turns his eyes. The Regent was never unoccupied, and had the most opposite amusements always at hand. On entering his study, where the council were to meet in 2 hours, he went toward an unfinished drawing, representing a scene from Daphnis and Chloe, and returned to the work, interrupted 2 days before by that famous game of tennis, which had commenced by a racket blow, and finished by the supper at Madame de Sabrin's. A messenger came to tell him that Madame Elizabeth Charlotte, his mother, had asked twice if he were up. The Regent, who had the most profound respect for the Princess Palatine, sent word that not only was he visible, but that if Madame were ready to receive him, he would pay her a visit directly. He then returned to his work with all the eagerness of an artist. Shortly after the door opened, and his mother herself appeared. Madame, the wife of Philippe, the first brother of the king, came to France after the strange and unexpected death of Madame Henry of England, to take the place of that beautiful and gracious princess, who had passed from the scene like a dream. This comparison, difficult to sustain for any newcomer, was doubly so to the poor German princess, who, if we may believe her own portrait, with her little eyes, her short and thick nose, her long thin lips, her hanging cheeks, and her large face, was far from being pretty. Unfortunately, the faults of her face were not compensated for by beauty of figure. She was little and fat, with a short body and legs, and such frightful hands that she avows herself that there were none uglier to be found in the world, and that it was the only thing about her to which Louis XIV could never become accustomed. But Louis XIV had chosen her, not to increase the beauties of his court, but to extend his influence beyond the Rhine. By the marriage of his brother with the Princess Palatine, Louis XIV, who had already acquired some chance of inheritance in Spain, by marrying Maria Theresa, and by Philippe the First's marriage with the Princess Henriette, only sister Charles II, would acquire new rights over Bavaria, and probably in Palatinate. He calculated, and calculated rightly, that her brother, who was delicate, would probably die young and without children. Madame, instead of being treated at her husband's death according to her marriage contract, and forced to retire into a convent, or into the old castle of Montargis, was, in spite of Madame de Maintenon's hatred, maintained by Louis XIV. In all the titles and honors which she enjoyed during her husband's lifetime, although the king had not forgotten the blow which he gave to young Duc de Chartres at Versailles, when he announced his marriage with Mademoiselle de Blois. The proud princess, with her 32 quarterings, thought it humiliation that her son should marry a woman whom the royal legitimation could not prevent from being the fruit of a double adultery. At the first moment, unable to command her feelings, she revenged herself by this maternal correction, rather exaggerated, when a young man of 18 was the object for the affront offered to the honor of her ancestors. As the young Duc de Chartres had himself only consented unwillingly to this marriage, he easily understood his mother's dislike to it, though he would have preferred, doubtless, that she should have shown it in a rather less Teutonic manner. The result was that when Monsieur died and the Duc de Chartres became Duc d'Orleans, his mother, who might have feared that the blow of Versailles had left some disagreeable reminiscence in the mind of the new master of the Palais Royal, found, on the contrary, a more respectful son than ever. This respect increased, and as regent he gave his mother a position equal to that of his wife. When Madame de Berry, his much-loved daughter, asked her father for a company of guards, he granted it, but ordered at the same time that a similar company should be given to his mother. Madame held thus a high position, and if, in spite of that position, she had no political influence, the reason was that the regent made it a principle of action never to allow women to meddle with state affairs. It may be also that Philippe II, Regent of France, was more reserved toward his mother than toward his mistresses, for he knew her epistolary inclinations, and he had no fancy for seeing his projects made the subjects of the daily correspondence which she kept up with the Princess Wilhelmina Charlotte and the Duke Anthony Ulrich of Brunswick. In exchange for this loss, he left her the management of the house and of his daughters, which, from her overpowering idleness, the Duchesse d'Orleans abandoned willingly to her mother-in-law. In this last particular, however, the poor Palatine, if one may believe the memoirs written at the time, was not happy. Madame de Berry lived publicly with Riam, and Mademoiselle de Valois was secretly the mistress of Richelieu, who, without anybody knowing how, and as if he had the enchanted ring of Gyges, appeared to get into her rooms, in spite of the guards who watched the doors, in spite of the spies with whom the regent surrounded him, and though, more than once, he had hidden himself in his daughter's room to watch. As to Mademoiselle de Chartres, whose character had as yet seemed much more masculine than feminine, she, in making a man of herself, as one may say, seemed to forget that other men existed, when, some days before the time at which we have arrived, being at the opera and hearing her music master, Cottereau, the finished and expressive singer of the Academic Royal, who, in a love scene, was prolonging a note full of the most exquisite grace and feeling, the young princess, carried away by artistic enthusiasm, stretched out her arms and cried aloud, "Ah, my dear Cottereau!" This unexpected exclamation had troubled her mother, who had sent away the beautiful tenor, and, putting aside her habitual apathy, determined to watch over her daughter, herself. There remained the Princess Louise, who was afterward Queen of Spain, and Mademoiselle Elizabeth, who became the Duchesse de Lorraine. But as to them there was nothing said. Either they were really wise, or else they understood better than their elders how to restrain the sentiments of their hearts, or the accents of passion. As soon as the prince saw his mother appear, he thought something new was wrong in the rebellious troop of which he had taken command, and which gave her such trouble. But as nothing could make him forget the respect which, in public and in private, he paid to his mother, he rose on seeing her, and after having bowed and taken her hand to lead her to a seat, he remained standing himself. "Well, my son," said Madame, with a strong German accent, "what is this that I hear, and what happened to you last evening?" "Last evening," said the regent, recalling his thoughts and questioning himself. "Yes," answered the Palatine, "last evening, in coming home from Madame de Sabrin's." "Oh, it is only that," said the prince. "How only that?" "Your friend Simeon goes about everywhere saying that they want to carry you off, and that you only escape by coming across the roofs, a singular road, you will confess, for the region of the kingdom, and by which, however devoted they may be to you, I doubt your ministers being willing to come to your counsel." "Simeon is a fool, mother," answered the regent, not able to help laughing at his mother still scolding him as if he were a child. "It was not anybody who wanted to carry me away, but some roisterers who had been drinking in some cabaret by the Barrier de Surgeons, and who were come to make a row in the Rue de Bons Enfants. As to the road we followed, it was for no sort of flight upon earth that I took it, but simply to gain a wager which that drunken Simeon is furious at having lost." My son," said the Palatine, shaking her head, "you will never believe in danger, and yet you know what your enemies are capable of. Believe me, my child, those who calumniate the soul with few scruples about killing the body, And you know that the Duchesse de Maine has said that the very day when she is quite sure that there is really nothing to be made out of her bastard of a husband, she will demand an audience of you and drive her dagger into your heart. Bah! My mother, answered the regent, laughing. Have you become sufficiently good Catholic no longer to believe in predestination? I believe in it, as you know. Would you wish me to plague my mind about a danger which has no existence, or which, if it does exist, has its result already inscribed in the eternal book? No. My mother, no. The only use of all these exaggerated precautions is to sadden life. Let tyrants tremble. But who and what street Simon pretends to be, the most debonair man since Louis le Debonair. What have I to fear? Oh, mon Dieu! Nothing, my dear son, said the Palatine, taking the hand of the prince, and looking at him with as much maternal tenderness as her little eyes were capable of expressing. Nothing, if everyone knew you as well as I do, and saw you so truly good that you cannot hate even your enemies. But Henry IV, whom unluckily you resemble a little too much on certain points, was as good, and that did not prevent the existence of a Ravaillac. Alas! Mein Gott, continued the princess, mixing up French and German in her agitation, it is always the best kings that they do assassinate. Tyrants take precautions, and the poniard never reaches them. You must never go out without a guard. It is you and not I, my son, who require a regiment of soldiers. My mother, answered the regent. Will you listen to story? Yes, certainly, for you relate them exquisitely. Well, you know that there was in Rome, I forget in what precise year of the Republic, a very brave consul who had the misfortune, shared by Henry IV, and myself, of going out of a night. It happened that this consul was sent against the Carthaginians, and having invented an implement of war called a crow, he gained the first naval battle in which the Romans had been victors, so that when he returned to Rome, congratulating himself beforehand, no doubt, on the increase of fortune which would follow his increase of reputation, he was not deceived. All the population awaited him at the city gates, and conducted him in triumph to the capital, where the Senate expected him. The Senate announced to him that, in reward for his victory, they were going to bestow on him something which must be highly pleasing to him, which was that whenever he went out he should be preceded by a musician who should announce to everyone, by playing on the flute, that he was followed by the famous Duilius, the conqueror of the Carthaginians. Duilius, you will understand, my mother was at the height of joy at such an honor. He returned home with a proud bearing, and preceded by his flute player, who played his best amid the acclamations of the multitude, who cried at the top of their voices, Long live Duilius! Long live the conqueror of the Carthaginians! Long live the savior of Rome! This was so intoxicating that the poor consul nearly went crazy with joy. Twice during the day he went out, although he had nothing to do in the town, only to enjoy the senatorial privilege, and to hear the triumphal music and the cries which accompanied it. This occupation had raised him by the evening into a state of glorification, such as it is not easy to explain. The evening came. The conqueror had a mistress whom he loved, and whom he was eager to see again, a sort of Madame de Sabrin, with the exception that the husband thought proper to be jealous, while ours, as you know, is not so absurd. The consul therefore had his bath, dressed and perfumed himself with the greatest care, and when 11 o'clock arrived, he set out on tiptoe for the subterranean road. But he had reckoned without his host, or rather, without his musician. Hardly had he gone 4 steps when the flute player, who was attached to his service by night as well as day, darted from a post on which he was seated, and went before, playing with all his might and main. The consequence of this was that those who were in the streets turned round, those who were home came to the door, and those who were in bed got up and opened their windows, all repeating in chorus, Here is the consul Duilius. Long live Duilius. Long live the conqueror of the Carthaginians. Long live the savior of Rome. This was highly flattering, but inopportune. The consul wished to silence his instrumentalist, but he declared that the orders he had received from the Senate were precise, not to be quiet a minute, that he had 10,000 sesterces a year to blow his flute, and that blow he would as long as he had any breath left. The consul saw that it was useless to discuss with a man who had the dictate of the Senate on his side, so he began to run, hoping to escape from his melodious companion, But he copied his actions from those of Duilius with such exactitude that all the consul could gain was to get before the flute player instead of behind him. He doubled like a hare, sprang like a roebuck, rushed madly forward like a wild boar. The cursed flute player did not lose his track for an instant, so that all Rome, understanding nothing about the object of this nocturnal race, but knowing that it was the victor who performed it, came to their windows, shouting, "Long live Duilius! Long live the conqueror of the Carthaginians! Long live the savior of Rome!" The poor man had one last hope, that of finding the people at his mistress's house asleep and the door half open, as she had promised to leave it. But no! As soon as he arrived at that hospitable and gracious house, at whose door he had so often poured perfumes and hung garlands, he found that they were awake like all the rest. At the window he saw the husband, who, as soon he saw him, began to cry, "Long live Duilius! Long live the conqueror of the Carthaginians! Long live the savior of Rome!" The hero returned home despairing. The next day he hoped to escape as musician, but this hope was fallacious, and it was the same the day after and all following days, so that the consul, seeing that it was impossible to keep his incognito, left for Sicily, where out of anger he beat the Carthaginians again, but this time so unmercifully that everyone thought that must be the end of all Punic wars past, present, or to come. Rome was so convulsed with joy that it gave public rejoicings like those on the anniversary of the foundation of the city, and proposed to give the conqueror a triumph more splendid even than the last. As to the Senate, it assembled before the arrival of Duilius to determine what reward should be conferred upon him. They were all in favor of a public statue, when suddenly they heard shouts of triumph and the sound of a flute. It was the consul who had freed himself from the triumph, thanks to his haste, but who could not free himself from public gratitude, thanks to his flute player. Suspecting that they were preparing something new, he came to take part in the deliberations. He found the Senate ready to vote, with their balls in their hands. He advanced to the tribune. "Conscript fathers," said he, "is it not your intention to give me a reward which will be agreeable to me?" "Our intention," replied the president, "is to make you the happiest man on earth." "Good," said Duilius. "Will you allow me to ask from you that which I desire most?" "Speak," cried all the senators at once. "And you will confer it on me?" asked he, with all the timidity of doubt. "By Jupiter we will," answered the president in the name of the assembly. "Then, conscript fathers," said Duilius, "if you think that I have deserved well the country, take away from me, in recompense for this second victory, this cursed flute player whom you gave me for the first." The Senate thought the request strange, but they had pledged their word, and at that period people kept their promises. The flute player was allowed to retire on half pay, and the consul Duilius, having got rid of his musician, recovered his incognito, and without noise found the door of that little house in the subterranean road, which one victory had closed against him, and which another had reopened. "Well," asked the Palatine, "what has this story to do with the fear I have of your being assassinated?" "What has it to do with it, my mother?" said the prince, laughing. "It is that if, instead of the one musician which the consul Duilius had, and which caused him such disappointment, I had a regiment of guards, you may fancy what would happen to me." "Ah, Philippe," answered the princess, laughing and sighing at the same time, "will you always treat serious matters so lightly?" "No, mother," said the regent, "and the proof is that as I presume you did not come here solely to read me a lecture on my nocturnal courses, but to speak on business, I am ready to listen to you, and to reply seriously." "Yes, you are right," said the princess. "I did come to speak to you of other things. I came to speak of Mademoiselle de Chartres." "Yes, of your favorite, mother, for it is useless to deny it. Louise is your favorite. Can it be because she does not love her uncles much, whom you do not love at all?" "No, it is not that, but I confess it is pleasing to me to see that she has no better opinion of bastards than I have. But it is because, except as to beauty, which she has and I never had, she is exactly what I was at her age, having true boy's tastes, loving dogs, horses, and cavalcades, managing powder like an artilleryman, and making squibs like a workman. Well, guess what has happened to her? She wants a commission in the guards. No, she wants to be a nun. A nun? Louise. Impossible. It must be some joke of her sister's. Not at all, replied the Palatine. There is no joke about it. I swear to you. How has she got this passion for the cloister? Asked the regent, beginning to believe in the truth of what his mother told him, accustomed as he was to live at a time when the most extravagant things were always the most probable. Where did she get it? Replied Madame. Why, from the devil, I suppose. I do not know where else she could have got it. The day before yesterday she passed with her sister, riding, shooting, laughing. In fact, I had never seen her so gay. But this evening Madame d'Orléans sent for me. I found Mademoiselle de Chartres at her mother's knees, in tears, and begging permission to retire to the Abbey de Chelles. Her mother turned to me and said, "What do you think of this, madam?" "I think," I replied, "that we can perform our devotions equally well in any place, and that all depends on our own preparations." But hearing my words, Mademoiselle de Chartres redoubled her prayers, and with so much earnestness that I said to her mother, "It is for you to decide." "Oh," replied the Duchess, "we cannot prevent this poor child from performing her devotions." "Let her go, then," I replied, "and may God grant that she goes in that intention." "I swear to you, madam," said Mademoiselle de Chartres, "that I go for God alone, and that I am influenced by no worldly idea." Then she embraced us, and yesterday morning at 7 o'clock she set out. "I know all that, since I was to have taken her there," replied the regent. "Has nothing happened since then?" "Yes. Yesterday evening she sent back the carriage, giving the coachman a letter addressed to you, to her mother, and to me, in which she says that finding in the cloister that tranquility and peace which she cannot hope for in the world, she does not wish to leave it." "And what does her mother say to this resolution?" "Her mother," replied Madame. "To tell you the truth, I believe her mother is very glad, for she likes convents, and thinks it a great piece of good luck to have a daughter a nun. But I say there is no happiness where there is no vocation." The regent read and reread the letter of Mademoiselle de Chartres, trying to discover, by the expression of her desire to remain at Chelles, the secret causes which had given rise to it. Then, after an instant of meditation, as deep as if the fate of empires depended on it, "There is some love pique here," said he. "Do you know if Louise loves anyone?" Madame told the regent the adventure of the opera and the exclamation of the princess, in her admiration for the handsome tenor. "Diable!" cried the regent. "And what did you and the Duchesse d'Orléans do in your maternal council?" "We showed Caucheraud the door, and forbade the opera to Mademoiselle de Chartres. We could not do less." "Well," replied the regent, "there is no need to seek further. We must cure her at once of this fancy." "And how will you do that, my son?" "I will go today to the Abbey de Chelles and interrogate Louise. If the thing is but a caprice, I will give it time to pass off. I will appear to adopt her views. And in a year hence, when she is to take the veil, she herself will come and beg us to free her from the difficulties she has got herself into. If, on the contrary, the thing is serious, then it will be different." "Mon Dieu," said Madame, rising, "remember that poor Caucheraud has, perhaps, nothing to do with it, and that he is even ignorant of the passion he has inspired." "Do not be afraid," replied the prince, laughing at the tragic interpretation which the princess, with her German ideas, had given to his words. "I shall not renew the lamentable history of the lovers of the Paraclete. Caucheraud's voice shall neither lose nor gain a single note in this adventure, and we do not treat a princess of the blood in the same manner as a little bourgeoise." "But, on the other hand," said Madame, almost as much afraid of the regent's real indulgence as of his apparent severity, "no weakness either." "My mother," said the regent, "if she must deceive someone, I would rather that it was her husband than God." And kissing his mother's hand respectfully, he led her to the door, quite scandalized at those easy manners, among which she died, without ever having accustomed herself to them. Then the Duc d'Orléans returned to his drawing, humming an air from his opera of Pour thee. In crossing the antechamber, Madame saw a little man in great riding boots coming toward her, his head sunk in the immense collar of a coat lined with fur. When he reached her, he poked out of surtout a little face with a pointed nose, and bearing resemblance at once to a polecat and a fox. "Oh," said the Palatine, "is it you, Abbé?" "Myself, your Highness. I have just saved France, nothing but that." And bowing to Madame, without waiting for her to dismiss him, as etiquette required, he turned on his heel and entered the regent's study without being announced.